James Morgan stood motionless before the massive window of his mansion, staring out at the hazy London skyline in the distance. The clouds hung low, casting a gray blanket over the city, their reflection warping slightly in the spotless glass panes that surrounded his home. Nestled atop a secluded hill, his residence loomed like a fortress, a symbol of opulence and isolation. The house, an architectural marvel of glass and steel, was equipped with the latest technological advancements, making it one of the most secure and advanced properties in all of the United Kingdom. But beneath the glossy surface of this modern sanctuary was an overwhelming emptiness that even the finest technology could not fill. James, 28 years old, was a prodigy. Born into one of the wealthiest families in England, he had inherited an empire of investments and industries that spanned continents. Yet, unlike many heirs of fortune, James hadn't coasted through life on the coattails of his family's success. Instead, he had taken the Morgan legacy to new heights with his own groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence and robotics. By the age of 25, James had filed patents for revolutionary technologies, founded companies, and amassed even more wealth than his predecessors. He was admired in the tech world for his genius and respected in business circles for his acumen. But behind this success, James harbored a secret that few people knew about, a secret that defined every aspect of his existence. From an early age, James had been diagnosed with a rare and severe allergic condition. His body violently rejected any form of human contact. Even the lightest touch from another person could trigger a life-threatening anaphylactic reaction. It was a cruel, invisible prison that bound him to a life of physical isolation. As a child, he'd spent years in and out of hospitals, subject to endless tests and treatments, all in vain. There was no cure, and James had come to terms with the reality that his life would be spent in solitude. But while he had accepted the physical constraints of his condition, the emotional toll was another matter entirely. The walls he had built around himself, both literal and metaphorical, were growing higher every year. Inside his fortress, James surrounded himself with machines, gadgets, AI assistants, robotic aids. They served every practical need, performing tasks with precision and efficiency. Yet, none of them could touch the loneliness that haunted him. James turned away from the window, his expression as impassive as ever, and began walking through the sleek, expansive hallway of his mansion. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the walls decorated with minimalistic artwork, chosen more for its aesthetic neutrality than any personal connection. As he passed a series of doors, each leading to a different section of the house, he felt the familiar weight of silence bearing down on him. His mansion, a technological wonder of the modern world, was far more than just a luxurious home. It was his sanctuary, a sterile bubble where he could control every variable of his life. Advanced security systems tracked his every move, scanning for any anomalies. The air was filtered, the temperature carefully regulated, and every surface sanitized by an automated cleaning system. No one entered without clearance, and even then, those who did were rarely allowed near him. Contact with the outside world was minimal and tightly controlled. James arrived at his personal study, the nerve center of his life. It was a vast room dominated by state-of-the-art technology, large holographic displays, touch-sensitive surfaces, and an array of sleek devices designed to facilitate his work. The room felt sterile, much like the rest of the house, devoid of anything that might hint at a personal life. No family photos, no mementos from childhood, no clutter. Just the hum of machines and the soft glow of monitors displaying complex data and algorithms. This was where James thrived professionally, where his genius came alive. But it was also where he was most alone. He sat at his desk, the chair a custom-made ergonomic model that conformed perfectly to his body, designed to minimize any physical discomfort. His fingers moved fluidly over the holographic interface, bringing up charts, financial reports, and emails from various business associates. The flow of information was constant, but James found little interest in any of it tonight. It was all the same discussions about new AI developments, requests for meetings he would never attend in person, projections of profits from his latest ventures. He had the world at his fingertips, yet it all felt increasingly hollow. After a while, James leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen without really seeing it. The silence in the room was oppressive, a stark reminder that the only sound he ever heard was the hum of machines. He glanced at the corner of the room where Alpha, his personal AI assistant, stood dormant, waiting for a command. "Alpha," he called, his voice calm but devoid of emotion. The assistant activated instantly, its smooth, metallic frame illuminated by soft blue lights. Its voice was modulated to be soothing, yet neutral, designed to evoke neither comfort nor unease. "Yes, Mr. Morgan. How may I assist you?" Alpha responded, its tone polite, efficient. "Review tomorrow's agenda," James said, leaning forward slightly. A holographic projection appeared in the air, displaying a neatly organized list of virtual meetings, project updates, and deadlines. James scanned the information quickly, though none of it really mattered to him. His life had become a series of routines, controlled and managed by his technology. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing moved him. "Clear the schedule," he said abruptly. Alpha hesitated for a brief moment, processing the unexpected command. "Are you certain, Mr. Morgan? You have several important." "I said clear it," James repeated, his tone firm but still quiet. The holographic projection disappeared, and Alpha's lights dimmed as it powered down its projection systems. James remained seated, staring into the space where the holographic display had been, his thoughts drifting to places he rarely allowed them to go. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt human. Sure, he was alive, breathing, his heart beating like anyone else's. But the essence of what it meant to be human, the connections, the warmth, the simple touch of another person, those were things that had been denied to him his entire life. Growing up, his parents had done their best to shield him from the harshness of his condition, but even their love had felt distant. Protective but distant. He had been educated by private tutors, never setting foot in a school, never making friends. There had been no first crushes, no childhood games, no adolescent rebellion. Just a carefully controlled environment designed to keep him alive. He had tried to compensate for the lack of physical connection by diving into his work. Robotics fascinated him because it was a way to interact with the world without the need for touch. Machines didn't need emotional connections. They didn't care about his condition. They followed commands, performed tasks, and never questioned the coldness that emanated from him. But even machines couldn't fill the void. James stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back and walking out of the room. The house was eerily silent as he moved through it, his footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors. The sun had fully set by now, casting the house in shadows, with only the distant lights of London flickering in the horizon. He moved towards the expansive living room, a minimalist space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. The skyline was a sea of lights, stretching as far as the eye could see. But to James, it was just another reminder of how far removed he was from the rest of the world. The fire in the sleek, modern fireplace flickered gently, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill in the air. James approached the glass wall, placing his hand against the cool surface. It was the closest he could ever come to touching the outside world. His reflection stared back at him, pale and emotionless, framed by the darkness of the night. There was no one in this house who would ever touch him, no one who would hold him, or even brush past him in a moment of casual contact. And that, he reminded himself, was how it had to be. A soft chime echoed through the room, breaking the silence. Alpha had detected a new message in his inbox. James ignored it. He had no interest in the constant stream of communications that flowed his way. He was rich, successful, and respected, yet none of it seemed to matter. His fortune couldn't buy what he truly craved: connection. He thought back to the last conversation he had with his virtual therapist months ago. The AI-driven program had told him what he already knew, but refused to confront. "You've built walls around yourself, James. Walls to protect you from pain, but those same walls keep you from living." At the time, he had dismissed the words as robotic platitudes. Of course, he had walls. He needed them. Without them, he wouldn't survive. But as the months dragged on, the isolation weighed heavier than it ever had before. With a sigh, James turned away from the window. He needed to get out of his own head, to stop the constant churn of thoughts that always seemed to circle back to the same place. Loneliness. It was an affliction just as real as his physical condition, and one he couldn't escape. He could escape from people, from their touch, but not from the ache of solitude that gnawed at him night after night. Alpha, shut down all systems for the night, he ordered. The lights dimmed, the fire slowly extinguished itself, and the mansion plunged into darkness. James was left standing alone in the center of his fortress, the quiet hum of machinery now silenced, with only the faint glow of the city in the distance to keep him company. For all his brilliance, for all his wealth and success, James Morgan, the genius, the innovator, the billionaire, was at his core just a man trapped in a glass box, staring out at a world he could never truly touch. Sophie Turner's apartment was a chaotic mess, the physical embodiment of the life she was trying and failing to keep together. Scattered across every surface were the remnants of unfinished projects, sketches of robotic designs, and notes filled with ideas that once held promise but had now become just dreams she couldn't afford to chase. In the middle of the clutter, the most immediate problem stared back at her. Final notice. Eviction, in 7 days. Her fingers crumpled the paper, anger and despair twisting inside her. How had it come to this? Only a year ago, she had been on the verge of success. Her company, once a rising star in London's competitive tech world, had been creating the next generation of robotics. Investors had backed her, partners had praised her genius, and the future had seemed bright. But one bad deal, one wrong partner who had used her technology for fraudulent activities, and everything came crashing down. Now she was bankrupt, with lawsuits piling up, creditors breathing down her neck, and nowhere to turn. Her former business partner had vanished, leaving her to deal with the legal fallout. Worse, her reputation in the tech industry was in shambles. No one wanted to work with her now, not after the scandal. Sophie paced the small space, trying to think of a way out. She had dodged every call from the authorities and debt collectors, but she couldn't run forever. If I don't do something soon, she thought, I'll lose everything. The buzzing of her phone on the kitchen table pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't recognize the number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, probably another creditor, another demand for money she didn't have. But something made her pick it up. Hello? She answered cautiously. Miss Turner? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unflinchingly calm. My name is Eliza Harrington. I represent a private client who has a business proposition for you. Sophie frowned, her skepticism flaring. I'm not interested in any more business deals, she replied, her voice edged with bitterness. I've had enough of those to last a lifetime. I understand you've had difficulties recently, Eliza continued, her tone never wavering. That's exactly why we're reaching out to you. My client is offering a solution to your financial troubles, but it's not a conventional job offer. This would be a highly unusual contract, requiring absolute discretion. However, if you agree, all your debts could be erased. Sophie blinked, stunned into silence for a moment. A solution to my financial troubles? It sounded too good to be true, and she had learned the hard way that things which seemed too good usually were. What kind of job is this? She asked, her suspicion growing. And who is this mysterious client? Eliza didn't answer immediately, as if weighing how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her words were deliberate, carefully chosen. My client is a very private individual. He's an influential man, wealthy beyond imagination, but he lives in complete isolation due to a rare medical condition. He's unable to interact with people directly, and that's where you come in. He requires an assistant who can be physically present, but not human. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. Not human? What exactly are you asking me to do? Sophie pressed, her tone sharp. Eliza continued calmly, as if explaining something perfectly ordinary. Mr. Morgan, my client, believes he is in need of a highly advanced robotic companion to assist him. He has already employed various machines in the past, but none have met his increasingly demanding expectations. However, those closest to him, including myself, believe that what he truly needs is something more complex, more nuanced. Sophie's stomach twisted as the realization began to dawn. You want me to pretend to be a robot? She said flatly, incredulity creeping into her voice. Eliza didn't hesitate. Precisely. You're uniquely qualified, Miss Turner. Your knowledge of AI, robotics, and human behavior is exactly what we need. Mr. Morgan must never know that you're human. He's under the impression that a new prototype, more advanced than anything on the market, has been developed specifically for him. We've ensured that you'll have access to everything you need to convincingly play that role. The full weight of what Eliza was suggesting hit Sophie like a truck. She was supposed to live with this man, pretending to be one of the robots she had spent her career designing? This is insane, Sophie muttered, running a hand through her hair. He'll figure it out. No one could fool a person like that. Mr. Morgan doesn't interact with people, Eliza replied smoothly. His condition has kept him isolated for years. He has no point of comparison for human behavior anymore. The few people who do interact with him remotely, of course, know how to maintain the illusion. And you, Miss Turner, have the skills to pull this off. Sophie's mind raced. James Morgan. Of course, she knew who he was. The tech world buzzed with rumors about him, the reclusive billionaire genius who had revolutionized AI and robotics. His innovations had changed industries, but no one had seen him in public for years. There were whispers about his condition, but nothing concrete. Now it made sense. He was wealthy, brilliant, and completely cut off from the world. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. And what happens if I'm discovered? If he finds out I'm not a robot? Eliza's voice remained even, but there was a subtle undercurrent of warning in her tone. Let's just say that Mr. Morgan values privacy and discretion above all else. It would not be in your best interest to fail. But if you succeed, your debts will be erased, and you will be well compensated. It's a risk, yes, but given your current circumstances, I would argue it's worth taking. Sophie glanced around her apartment at the unpaid bills, the eviction notice, the project she would never finish if she didn't find a way out. What choice do I have? She thought. She was desperate, and this was her only option. But the idea of deceiving someone like James Morgan, of living in his home while pretending to be something she wasn't, terrified her. I need to think about it, Sophie said finally, though she knew deep down she didn't have the luxury of time. I'll send the details to your email, Eliza responded, her voice businesslike once again. But don't take too long. The offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. The line went dead, leaving Sophie standing in the middle of her apartment, her phone still clutched in her hand. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. The next day, after a night of restless sleep and endless back and forth deliberation, Sophie stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. A robot, she thought again. I'm going to pretend to be a robot. She had opened the email from Eliza that morning. The instructions were detailed, outlining everything she would need to do to prepare. They would provide her with the necessary materials, a specially designed bodysuit, embedded with sensors to mimic robotic behavior, along with access to tools she would need to keep up the charade. Sophie would need to study every detail, master the movements, and even modulate her voice to sound slightly artificial. There was no room for error. Her phone buzzed, and she looked down to see a message from Eliza. The car will arrive in 30 minutes. Be ready. Sophie closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. This is it. She gathered what little she could carry, packed it into a small bag, and took one last look around her apartment. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. Now, she was leaving everything behind, her past, her name, and the person she had been. For the foreseeable future, she would become someone, or rather something, else entirely. The ride to the Morgan estate was quiet, the landscape outside shifting from the familiar gray of London to the serene, empty roads leading to the outskirts of the city. The car pulled up to the mansion, an imposing structure of glass and steel, looming in the distance like a fortress. The driver opened her door without a word. Sophie stepped out, her breath catching in her throat as she stared up at the massive front gates. This was it. Once she entered, there would be no turning back. She would have to become the perfect illusion of a machine in the life of a man who believed only in technology. As the gates swung open, she felt the weight of her decision settle over her. I have to succeed, she thought. There's no other option. Sophie sat motionless in the back seat of the sleek black car as it wound its way through the secluded roads leading to James Morgan's mansion. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the impossible task ahead. She had practiced endlessly, fine-tuning every movement, every gesture to mimic the mechanical precision of the most advanced humanoid robots on the market. But now, As the imposing glass and steel structure of the mansion came into view, she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that it wouldn't be enough. "You're not Sophie anymore," she reminded herself. "You're a machine. Calm, efficient, emotionless." The car pulled to a stop in front of the towering gates, and Sophie took a deep breath. The suit she wore, a custom-designed bodysuit embedded with hidden sensors, clung to her skin like a second layer. It was both suffocating and liberating, reminding her that she wasn't just herself anymore. She was about to step into the role of a robot, and any mistake, no matter how small, could expose her. The gates swung open silently, and the car rolled through, stopping at the grand entrance of the mansion. The driver, as cold and silent as the rest of the operation, opened her door. Sophie stepped out, the weight of her task pressing down on her as she glanced up at the massive house. It was even more imposing in person, all sharp lines and reflective surfaces, as if the building itself were designed to keep the world at arm's length, much like its owner. Sophie walked toward the front doors, her steps measured, deliberate. Every movement had to be perfect, no hesitation, no fidgeting, no sign of the nervousness bubbling inside her. She was no longer a woman stepping into a stranger's life. She was a machine, programmed to perform flawlessly. The large, glass doors opened automatically as she approached, the sensors embedded in them whirring softly as they detected her presence. Inside, the foyer was vast and immaculate. The floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the walls were lined with minimalistic art. It was sterile, cold, yet undeniably elegant. Sophie could feel the weight of the silence around her. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, a place where human warmth had been stripped away, replaced with precision and control. And then, she saw him. James Morgan stood at the far end of the room, his back to her, staring out through a massive wall of glass that offered a panoramic view of the lush, rolling hills that surrounded his estate. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the horizon, but James remained still, as if he were immune to the beauty of it. He exuded a sense of control, an aura of someone who was used to mastering everything in his environment except, perhaps, his own isolation. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. Her heart raced, but she couldn't afford to let it show. "You're a machine. Machines don't panic." James didn't turn to face her immediately. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was calm, but laced with a quiet intensity. "So, you're the new prototype," he said, more as a statement than a question. Sophie fought the urge to clear her throat, instead responding in the smooth, emotionless tone she had practiced. "Yes, Mr. Morgan. I'm the latest model designed to meet your specifications." James finally turned, his gaze sweeping over her with the precision of someone who noticed every detail. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and for a moment, Sophie felt as though he was peering straight through her. His presence was commanding, yet there was an unmistakable edge of caution in his demeanor, as if he were constantly on guard. He studied her for a long moment, saying nothing, his expression unreadable. Sophie forced herself to remain still, her face neutral, her body poised as if waiting for a command. Every instinct screamed at her to react, to move, to speak, but she fought against it. "You're a robot. Stay in character." "Impressive," James said at last, his voice cold but curious. He took a step closer, his movements deliberate and slow, like a predator assessing its prey. "You're more refined than the previous models. More lifelike." Sophie's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I am designed to exceed previous performance levels, both in functionality and in interaction." James continued to circle her, his eyes never leaving her form, studying every aspect of her. His scrutiny was intense, making her feel as though he was waiting for her to slip up, to reveal something out of place. But she kept her posture perfect, her expression blank, resisting the urge to react. He stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he reached out, stopping just short of touching her face. The air between them was electric, charged with tension. Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but she remained still, unblinking. "Robots don't flinch. Your skin," he murmured, studying the synthetic material of the suit. "It's almost real." "Almost," Sophie responded evenly. It is designed to mimic human skin as closely as possible while maintaining the necessary durability for long-term use. James's lips twitched slightly, though it was difficult to tell if it was a smile or something more analytical. He dropped his hand and turned away, his attention shifting back to the large room they were standing in. He gestured toward the space as if it were part of some grand experiment. "You'll be working here," he said, his tone detached. "I expect efficiency, precision, and above all, silence. You'll find that I don't tolerate errors." Sophie nodded, a small, precise movement. "Understood, Mr. Morgan." He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable once more. "You've been programmed to assist with household tasks, monitor security systems, and respond to basic commands. But I assume you're also capable of adapting to new instructions?" "Yes," Sophie replied. "I am designed to learn and adapt to the needs of my environment. If additional tasks are required, I will integrate them into my systems." James walked toward a nearby console, pressing a few buttons that brought up a holographic display. Lines of code and system diagnostics floated in the air, casting a soft glow over the room. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Show me your adaptability," he said. "Follow the commands on this display." Sophie stepped forward, her eyes scanning the floating holographic interface. The commands were simple at first: adjusting the lighting, controlling temperature, and activating various security protocols throughout the house. She completed each task with practiced precision, her movements smooth, efficient, and controlled. But James wasn't watching the task she performed. He was watching her. Sophie could feel the weight of his gaze as he observed her every move, searching for any sign of hesitation, any imperfection that might give her away. She knew he was testing more than just her technical skills. He was probing for flaws, for anything that didn't fit the meticulous standards he expected from the machines that surrounded him. "Good," he said after a while, his voice calm but still tinged with that undercurrent of scrutiny. "You'll be performing these tasks regularly. I expect flawless execution. No mistakes." "Yes, Mr. Morgan," Sophie replied, keeping her voice flat, robotic. He turned away again, the moment of tension passing as he walked toward the far end of the room, where a series of large windows overlooked the estate grounds. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the vast lawn and reflecting off the glass walls. James stood silently for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, lost in thought. Sophie watched him, her mind racing. The first test had gone well, but she knew it was only the beginning. James Morgan was not a man who trusted easily. His world was one of precision, control, and isolation. And now, she was a part of that world, tasked with maintaining a lie that could unravel at any moment. He didn't look at her as he spoke again. "You may go for now. I'll summon you when I need you." Sophie nodded, her movements precise, and quietly exited the room. As she walked down the long, sterile hallway, her mind whirled with a mix of relief and anxiety. She had passed the first encounter, but James's eyes, those sharp, analytical eyes, would be watching her closely, waiting for the smallest crack in her facade. As she stepped into the room that had been assigned to her, Sophie finally allowed herself to breathe. The enormity of what she had just done washed over her. She was now inside James Morgan's world, playing a dangerous game of deception. One mistake, one misstep, and it would all come crashing down. But for now, she had survived, and she knew that she would have to be perfect from this point forward. There was no room for error. Not here. The room assigned to Sophie was stark and minimalistic, much like the rest of James Morgan's mansion. There were no personal touches, no warmth, only the essentials: a sleek, modern bed, a chair, a desk, and an array of monitors built into the walls. Everything was designed for efficiency, not comfort. As she sat on the edge of the bed, the coldness of the place began to seep into her bones. The tension from her first encounter with James still clung to her. She had managed to maintain the facade, but it had been a narrow escape. Every second in his presence felt like standing on a precipice, where one wrong move could send her plummeting into disaster. "He's watching you," she reminded herself. Always watching. The room had no windows, only the constant glow of the screens displaying live feeds from various security cameras scattered throughout the estate. Sophie assumed that James monitored these feeds obsessively, keeping a close eye on every inch of his fortress. He was a man who thrived on control, and she knew that her every move would be analyzed, measured, and scrutinized. As she stared at the screens, her mind raced. She needed to learn more about this place, about how things worked here. If she was going to keep up the charade, she couldn't afford to make mistakes. The estate systems were interconnected, complex, and cutting-edge, an extension of James's obsession with technology and control. The more she understood, the better chance she had of staying ahead of him. Sophie stood and approached the desk, her fingers hovering over the built-in console. She activated the screen with a light tap, and a series of files and system logs appeared. She quickly scanned through the data, absorbing as much as she could. The mansion's security protocols, the household automation systems, the AI assistants, everything was laid out in meticulous detail. She frowned as she came across the section about Alpha, the primary AI assistant that had been running the house long before she arrived. Alpha controlled everything from temperature regulation to security alarms. If James had relied on it for so long, why was she needed? Was Alpha malfunctioning, or was there something else James wanted that his AI couldn't provide? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime from the door. Sophie tensed, immediately returning to her practiced robotic posture before the door slid open. It was Alpha. The sleek, humanoid robot glided silently into the room, its metallic frame shimmering under the soft lighting. Its voice, calm and devoid of any inflection, filled the small space. "Mr. Morgan has requested your presence in the living room." Sophie nodded mechanically, maintaining the robotic demeanor. "Understood." As Alpha turned and left, Sophie exhaled slowly. Time to face him again. She had no idea what to expect this time. The brief respite she had hoped for was over, and she knew the pressure would only intensify from here. Sophie walked through the long, empty corridors of the mansion, her steps silent and measured. Every inch of this place was immaculate, polished to a cold perfection. The walls, mostly glass, gave a view of the sprawling estate outside, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see. Yet, despite the openness of the space, it felt suffocating, like a cage designed to keep out the messiness of the world beyond. When she entered the living room, James was standing near the windows, as he often seemed to do, gazing out at the landscape. The evening light bathed the room in soft shades of gold and amber, but the warmth of the colors did nothing to soften the chill that always seemed to follow him. He didn't turn around when she entered, but he knew she was there. Of that, Sophie was certain. "Do you know why I brought you here?" James asked after a long silence, his voice calm, but heavy with an undercurrent of something more. Sophie's mind raced. "You're supposed to be a machine," she reminded herself. "Machines don't speculate. They respond to direct questions." "I am here to assist you, Mr. Morgan," she said, keeping her voice even and flat. He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto her with that same piercing scrutiny. "Yes, you're here to assist me, but not just in the way the others did." He paused, watching her reaction, or rather, her lack of one. Sophie kept her expression neutral, like any well-programmed machine would. James began to pace, circling her slowly, as though he were inspecting her again. His hands were clasped behind his back, his gaze never leaving her for a moment. Sophie could feel the weight of his presence, the way he was testing her, searching for something. The others, James said, his voice dropping slightly, they were predictable, functional, but limited. "You're different." He stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're designed to learn, to adapt. Isn't that right?" Sophie nodded. "Yes, Mr. Morgan. I am designed to evolve based on your needs." James tilted his head slightly, studying her face, as though he could detect the smallest imperfection. "Tell me, what have you learned about me so far?" Sophie hesitated for the briefest moment, her mind racing. This was a trap, a test. She had to answer carefully. Robots didn't speculate about human behavior. They analyzed patterns they observed. She needed to give him something without giving away too much. "You were precise, methodical," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "You value efficiency and control in your environment." James smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A good observation. And what about human interaction? What have you learned about my relationship with other people?" Sophie's pulse quickened. "Don't slip." She couldn't afford to show any emotion. not even the faintest flicker of uncertainty. "You have limited direct contact with people, Mr. Morgan," she said carefully. "Your interactions are conducted through mediated systems. You maintain distance." He stepped closer, closing the gap between them until she could feel the faint presence of his breath. "And do you know why?" This time, Sophie didn't hesitate. "Yes, your condition prevents you from physical contact with others." James's smile vanished, replaced by something colder, more guarded. He stepped back, his posture stiffening. "My condition," he echoed, his tone darkening. "Yes, the reason for all of this." He turned away from her again, walking back to the windows. For a moment, there was only silence, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Sophie's mind raced, trying to anticipate his next move, to stay one step ahead. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the pressure building. "You know," James said quietly, still facing the window, "when I first learned about my condition, they told me it was a curse, that I'd never live a normal life. No contact, no intimacy, no human connection." His voice was distant, almost reflective, but over time, I realized it wasn't a curse. It was a shield, a way to keep the chaos of the world out. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Machines don't bring chaos. They bring order. They're reliable, predictable. They don't fail you the way people do." Sophie forced herself to stay perfectly still, her mind whirling with the implications of what he was saying. "He trusts machines more than people. That's why this works. He doesn't want to believe I could be anything else." "You won't fail me, will you?" James asked, his gaze piercing through her. "No, Mr. Morgan," Sophie replied, her voice as steady as she could make it. "I am programmed for reliability and precision. I will not fail you." James nodded, seemingly satisfied. He turned back to the window, his posture relaxing slightly. "Good. I've had enough failures in my life." For a moment, Sophie allowed herself to breathe. The tension in the room had eased, but it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. She had passed another test, but she knew it wouldn't be the last. James Morgan was a man who trusted nothing and no one. He would continue to watch her, to scrutinize her every move, waiting for the slightest slip. "Go," he said, waving her off without turning around. "I'll call for you when I need you again." Sophie nodded, turning to leave the room. As she walked back through the long, empty corridors of the mansion, she felt the weight of James's scrutiny still lingering. "He's not just testing me," she realized. "He's searching for something even he doesn't fully understand." She had survived the encounter, but the danger was far from over. The longer she stayed, the more she realized just how fragile the illusion she had created truly was. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. And then, where would that leave her? As Sophie walked through the cold, sterile corridors of James Morgan's mansion, her mind drifted to a place she had been trying to forget. It was as if the tension and the high-stakes performance she had just survived opened a door to memories she had buried deep. The robotic persona she wore so carefully now felt suffocating, and her thoughts began to unravel the events that had led her to this moment, to this bizarre and precarious situation where she was pretending to be something she wasn't. Her past, a cascade of memories she had tried to escape for months, now flooded her consciousness, pulling her back to the very beginning, to the days when she had been full of hope, ambition, and vision. Before everything had gone so terribly wrong, Sophie Turner had always been a dreamer, but not in the idle, fantastical way that people often associated with dreamers. Her dreams were grounded in mechanics, circuitry, and possibilities. As a child, she wasn't interested in the typical things that fascinated other kids. Dolls sat ignored on shelves while she tinkered with household appliances, determined to figure out how things worked. By the time she was 10, she could disassemble and reassemble most of the small machines in her home, much to her parents' frustration. But her curiosity was insatiable. She wasn't just interested in how things functioned, she wanted to improve them. To her, every object had untapped potential waiting to be unlocked. Her parents, though loving, had never fully understood her obsession with machines. They'd encouraged her to pursue more conventional paths, but Sophie's fascination with robotics and artificial intelligence only grew stronger as she entered her teenage years. The real turning point came when she was 16. Her father had brought home an outdated robotic vacuum cleaner that was destined for the trash. Instead of throwing it away, Sophie had spent days taking it apart and reprogramming it. By the end of the week, she had transformed the clunky, barely functional machine into something that could navigate her entire house, avoiding obstacles, and even adapting its cleaning pattern based on the amount of dirt in different areas. It was then that Sophie knew her future was in robotics. At university, she found her place among like-minded peers who shared her passion for invention. Her natural talent, combined with a tireless work ethic, quickly set her apart. She wasn't just good at what she did, she was exceptional. In her third year, she began working on what would become her most ambitious project, Yet Harold, a humanoid robot designed to understand and respond to human emotions in real time. Sophie didn't want to create just another tool. She wanted to bridge the gap between humans and machines, to craft a companion that could offer emotional support in ways that no other technology could. Harold wasn't just a machine that followed commands. It could read facial expressions, analyze vocal tones, and adjust its responses based on the emotional state of the person interacting with it. The robot could offer comforting words when someone was sad, or remain silent during tense moments. It was empathetic, or at least it appeared to be. To Sophie, it was the culmination of everything she had worked toward a breakthrough in the relationship between humanity and technology. When she presented Harold at her university's annual tech showcase, it was met with awe. Professors, fellow students, and industry professionals who had been invited to the event all praised her creation. Word of her achievement spread quickly, and within weeks, Sophie had received offers from venture capitalists eager to fund her work. At just 23, Sophie Turner became the face of the future of robotics. The next few years were a whirlwind. Investors flocked to her, hungry to be part of the next big thing. Sophie launched her own startup, Turner Robotics, and the buzz surrounding her work grew. She was no longer just the brilliant young inventor from university. She was now a key player in the tech world, rubbing shoulders with CEOs and venture capitalists. Articles were written about her, hailing her as the next great innovator. But the higher she climbed, the more the pressure mounted. Sophie had entered the business world naive, believing that innovation was enough to guarantee success. But she quickly learned that the tech industry wasn't driven by ideas alone. Investors didn't care about the years of research or the painstaking work behind every invention. They cared about profits, about timelines, about the bottom line. And Sophie's early success had made her a target for people who saw in her a way to make money fast. That's when Michael Carrington entered her life. Michael was everything Sophie wasn't: suave, charismatic, and skilled at navigating the ruthless world of tech finance. He had a reputation for turning small startups into multi-million-dollar enterprises. And when he approached Sophie with a proposition to take Turner Robotics to the next level, she had been swept up by his vision. He promised her that together they would revolutionize the industry, that they would bring her ideas to the world in ways she had only dreamed of. At first, everything seemed perfect. Michael brought in more investors, more funding. He handled the business side of things, allowing Sophie to focus on what she did best: inventing. But soon, cracks began to show. Michael pushed her to rush prototypes, insisting that speed was more important than perfection. He wanted results, and he wanted them fast. "I don't care if it's not perfect," he had said during one of their many late-night meetings. "The market moves fast, Sophie. We need to strike while the iron's hot. Your robots are amazing, but they're no good to us if they're stuck in development forever." Sophie had protested. She knew the tech wasn't ready for mass production, but Michael had a way of smoothing over her concerns, promising her that everything would work out. And she, overwhelmed by the pressures of the business world she hadn't been prepared for, had gone along with it. Harold, once her pride and joy, was rushed into a commercial model, and Sophie watched helplessly as corners were cut in the manufacturing process. Her worst fears came true when the first batch of Harold units malfunctioned spectacularly. The robots that were supposed to provide emotional support instead exhibited erratic behavior, responding to users in ways that ranged from bizarre to unsettling. Complaints flooded in, and soon, the media caught wind of the disaster. Articles that had once hailed Sophie as the next big thing now labeled her a fraud, a reckless inventor who had failed to deliver on her promises. Michael had been quick to distance himself from the fallout. "It's a shame what happened," he'd said, shrugging as though he had no part in it. "But that's the risk in tech, right? You win some, you lose some." But Sophie knew the truth. Michael had gambled with her work, and when the gamble failed, he had walked away unscathed, leaving her to deal with the consequences. Her company collapsed. Lawsuits from investors and customers piled up. Her reputation in the tech world was ruined, and she was left with nothing but debt and regret. Michael disappeared from her life, taking whatever profits he could salvage, while Sophie was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered career. For months, she had tried to rebuild. She took on small freelance jobs, working in obscurity, far from the spotlight that had once shone so brightly on her. But no matter what she did, the debts continued to mount, and her reputation remained in tatters. No one in the industry wanted to take a chance on her. She was a pariah. It was during one of those dark days, when her eviction notice had been taped to her door and her bank account was frozen, that the call had come from Eliza Harrington. "All your debts erased. A fresh start," Eliza had said, her voice calm and persuasive. "My client is very particular. You're the only one who could do this, Sophie. You understand the technology, and you understand how to act." At first, Sophie had been incredulous. Pretend to be a robot? The idea seemed absurd, ridiculous even. But as Eliza laid out the details, the more Sophie realized she had no other options. She had nothing left to lose. She had accepted. Now, here she was, walking through the halls of James Morgan's mansion, pretending to be something she had once created. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had spent her life inventing machines to help people, was now pretending to be one to save herself. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of failure never more dire. If James Morgan discovered the truth, she would lose everything again. There was no room for error, no second chances. And yet, as she moved through the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was still with her, that no matter how far she ran, it would always be there, waiting to pull her back into the darkness. Sophie sat in her assigned room, the sterile walls closing in around her. The air in James Morgan's mansion always felt heavy, as though the weight of the technology and isolation permeated every space. She hadn't been summoned again since her last interaction with him, and the time alone gave her too much opportunity to think, to reflect on what she had signed up for, and how close she was to falling apart. Despite the meticulous role she played, the more she interacted with James, the harder it became to remain in character. It wasn't just the constant scrutiny he placed on her, watching her every move with unnerving intensity. It was something deeper, the way his isolation mirrored her own, the way his words seemed to carry an unspoken longing for something real, something beyond the cold efficiency of machines. She hadn't expected that from him. She had imagined him to be a man who lived fully in the world of machines, content to be surrounded by technology and devoid of any real connection. But the more time she spent around him, the more she began to see glimpses of the man hidden beneath the layers of control. And that made her role as a robot all the more difficult. The next day, Sophie was summoned to the living room again. As she walked through the mansion's endless corridors, she steeled herself, rehearsing her robotic posture, her carefully modulated voice. She had to maintain the facade, no matter what. When she entered the room, she found James once again standing by the enormous glass windows, his back to her as he often positioned himself, staring out at the world he kept at a distance. The setting sun bathed the room in a warm glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. But despite the beauty of the scene, there was something cold about the way James stood there, as though he were untouched by the light. Without turning around, he spoke. "You've been here for several days now," he said quietly. "I've been watching you." Sophie stood perfectly still, keeping her face expressionless. She had prepared for this moment, the inevitable review, the moment where he would test her again. "Yes, Mr. Morgan," she replied, her voice calm and even. "I am here to meet your expectations." James turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity behind his gaze that made Sophie's stomach tighten. "Expectations," he repeated, his voice thoughtful. "That's an interesting word. Tell me, do you understand what my expectations are?" Sophie knew this was another one of his tests, another opportunity for him to analyze her responses, to see if there was anything in her behavior that didn't quite fit. She had to tread carefully. "My primary function is to provide assistance," she said, her voice still mechanical, "to perform tasks efficiently and without error. while ensuring your environment remains optimal. James took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. And do you believe you've done that? Met my expectations? Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but outwardly, she remained composed. Yes, Mr. Morgan. I have performed all tasks as instructed. He circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving her. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sophie could feel her heart racing, though she kept her body still. Every step he took, every moment of silence, stretched the boundaries of her composure. Then, without warning, James stopped directly in front of her, his face close enough that she could feel the intensity of his presence. You're different, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something about you that's not like the others. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. He knows. For a terrifying moment, she was certain he could see through her, that somehow he had figured out that she wasn't what she claimed to be. But she couldn't break character. Not now. I am designed to adapt, she replied, her voice carefully controlled, to meet your specific needs in ways previous models could not. James's eyes searched hers, as if looking for something hidden beneath the surface. Adaptation, he murmured, stepping back slightly. That's the key, isn't it? The ability to change, to learn. Machines aren't supposed to do that, not really. They're supposed to follow their programming, follow orders. But you... Sophie said nothing, afraid that any response might give too much away. She had rehearsed for moments like this, but being under the weight of James's scrutiny was far more intense than she had imagined. Every word, every movement had to be calculated, and she was painfully aware that one mistake could unravel everything. James's expression shifted, softening for just a moment, though the tension in the room remained thick. Do you know why I prefer machines to people? He asked, his voice taking on a distant quality. Sophie remained silent, knowing that this was one of those moments where a machine wouldn't respond unless prompted. James turned away from her, his gaze drifting back to the windows. People are unpredictable, he said after a long pause. They lie, they disappoint, they leave. Machines don't. Machines do exactly what they're told, and they do it without question. There's a comfort in that, in knowing that something will work the way it's supposed to. Sophie's chest tightened as she listened. There was a sadness in his words that she hadn't expected. This man, with all his wealth and intelligence, is utterly alone. The thought weighed on her more than she had anticipated. She had spent so much time focused on her own struggles, her own desperation, that she hadn't fully considered the depths of James's isolation. Here was a man who had built his life around control and technology because he couldn't or wouldn't trust humans. The irony was overwhelming. He surrounded himself with machines to avoid the pain of human connection, and now here she was, a human pretending to be a machine. Do you ever wonder what it would be like, James continued, to be free of expectations? To just be? Sophie's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or simply thinking out loud. His voice was so raw, so unguarded, that it caught her off guard. I do not experience desire or wonder, Mr. Morgan, she replied, her voice mechanical once more. I am here to serve. James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course. That's what I've asked for, isn't it? A machine. No desires, no emotions. Just service. He turned to face her again, but this time his expression was softer, more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. But sometimes I wonder if that's really what I want. Sophie stood still, her mind racing. What is he saying? What does he want? The lines between her role and reality were beginning to blur, and it terrified her. James wasn't supposed to be this, human. He was supposed to be cold, distant, obsessed with his machines. But here he was showing vulnerability, exposing the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. And that made it harder for her to maintain hers. I've been alone for a long time, James admitted, his voice quiet. Longer than I'd like to remember. The machines, they fill the space, but they don't fill the silence. Not really. Sophie swallowed hard, fighting the urge to respond in a way that would betray her true nature. This wasn't what she had expected. She had come here prepared to deceive, to pretend to be the perfect robotic companion. But she hadn't anticipated the emotional complexity of the man standing in front of her. He was a puzzle she hadn't been ready to solve. You're doing what you were designed to do, James continued, as though trying to convince himself as much as her. "You're flawless, efficient, but it's strange." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the floor as if he were lost in thought. Then, after a long pause, he looked up at her again. "Do you think machines can understand loneliness?" Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. How do I answer that? She wasn't sure if he was asking her as the robot she was supposed to be, or if this was a deeper, more personal question. Either way, her response had to be perfect. But there was a part of her, the human part, that ached to answer truthfully. To tell him that yes, she understood loneliness more than he could ever know. But that wasn't what a machine would say. "No, Mr. Morgan," she replied, her voice steady and robotic. "Machines do not experience emotions such as loneliness." James's expression hardened slightly, as though he were disappointed by her response, but he said nothing more. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, he turned away, his shoulders sagging just slightly, as if the weight of the conversation had exhausted him. "You may go," he said quietly, his voice lacking the usual sharpness of his commands. Sophie nodded and left the room, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. As she walked back through the quiet corridors, the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with the weight of what had just transpired. She had come here expecting to deceive a man obsessed with control, but what she had found was someone far more complex, someone who was deeply, profoundly human. And that scared her more than anything else. She had to stay focused. She had to remember why she was here. But the more time she spent in James Morgan's world, the harder it became to keep her own walls intact. The man she was pretending to serve was starting to unravel her in ways she hadn't anticipated. And if she wasn't careful, the facade she had worked so hard to maintain would begin to crack. Sophie walked back to her room, her mind spinning from the conversation with James. She had barely managed to maintain her robotic facade during the encounter, but it was getting harder. The more time she spent around him, the more she understood that he wasn't the detached, purely rational figure she had imagined him to be. His words echoed in her mind. "Do you think machines can understand loneliness?" James Morgan was far more complex than she had anticipated. His brilliance, his obsessive need for control, and his isolation were intricately linked to something deeper, something raw and painful that went far beyond his condition. He had built a world where technology shielded him from the messy, unpredictable reality of human relationships. And yet, despite everything, it was clear that he longed for something more, perhaps even for connection. As Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, she tried to push these thoughts away. "You can't let this get to you," she reminded herself. "You're here to play a role, nothing more. If you slip up, everything falls apart." But no matter how hard she tried to compartmentalize, the truth gnawed at her. She wasn't just pretending to be a robot. She was pretending not to feel the same loneliness that James was struggling with. Her situation was eerily similar to his, isolated, trapped in a role she hadn't asked for, cut off from the life she had once envisioned for herself. But unlike James, she had chosen this path, desperate as it was. The next few days were quiet, almost routine. Sophie continued to perform her duties as the robot, managing the house's systems, monitoring security protocols, and completing the menial tasks James assigned to her. Most of the time, he barely spoke to her, observing her work from a distance. But even in his silence, Sophie could feel the weight of his watchful presence, as though he was constantly evaluating her every move. Occasionally, he would call her into his study or living room, asking her to complete specific tasks or simply stand in silence while he worked. These interactions were short, impersonal, but Sophie could sense an underlying tension in each one. It was as if James was waiting for her to break, waiting for the facade to crack, but not because he suspected her. It was almost as if he was hoping for it. Then came the day when things shifted. It started innocuously enough. James had called Sophie into his study that morning, his voice distant and distracted. When she arrived, he was standing behind his desk, staring at the large screen on the wall that displayed a series of complex blueprints. Sophie recognized the designs immediately. They were for a new AI interface James had been developing. The project was ambitious, even by his standards, aiming to create an AI system capable of not just learning from its environment, but evolving emotionally in real time. But something about the blueprint wasn't sitting right with him. "I've hit a wall," James muttered, his eyes scanning the screen. He didn't look at Sophie as he spoke, his frustration evident in the way his fingers tapped restlessly on the edge of the desk. The logic is sound, the algorithms are flawless, but it's not enough. Sophie remained silent, standing perfectly still as she always did in these moments. A part of her wanted to ask what he meant, to engage with him on a technical level, but she couldn't. She wasn't supposed to show initiative, not unless directly asked. Her role was to respond, not to act. James finally turned toward her, his brow furrowed, eyes tired. "Do you know why I'm working on this project?" Sophie's heart raced. "Don't slip up. Be the robot." "I do not possess knowledge of your motivations, Mr. Morgan," she replied evenly, her voice still carefully modulated. James stared at her for a long moment, and Sophie could feel the tension building. Then he let out a sigh, shaking his head. "Of course you don't. Machines don't question. They don't care." He walked around the desk and sat down, his hands rubbing his temples as if he were trying to ease a headache. "But that's the problem, isn't it? They don't care." Sophie stood there, feeling the weight of his words. There was something heartbreaking about the way he said it, not with anger, but with resignation. He wasn't talking about machines. Not really. He was talking about himself, about his own detachment from the world. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to the ceiling. "I've spent my whole life perfecting systems that work flawlessly, technology that never fails. But what's the point of perfection if there's no one to share it with?" Sophie's chest tightened. "Don't react. Don't let him see that this is getting to you." James continued, his voice growing quieter. "People are messy. They lie. They hurt you. They leave. But machines, they just work, or at least they're supposed to." His eyes met hers again, and this time, they held a weight that made Sophie's breath catch. "But you're different. I can't explain it, but you feel different." Her heart pounded, but she kept her face blank, her body still. She couldn't afford to let him see the panic building inside her. James stood up again, pacing around the room. "I know you're just another machine, another tool designed to meet my needs, but sometimes I forget. Sometimes it feels like there's more to you than there should be." Sophie remained silent, though her mind was screaming. "He's getting too close. He's starting to suspect." He stopped pacing and faced her once more. "What do you think, Sophie? Do you believe machines can change?" Her pulse quickened at the sound of her name. He rarely used it. Most of the time, she was simply an object to him, referred to as it or by generic terms. But now, there was something unsettlingly intimate in the way he addressed her. "I am designed to adapt, Mr. Morgan," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "My programming allows for learning and adjustments based on your needs." James smirked, though it was more bitter than amused. "Right, of course. Adaptation." He turned away again, walking back toward the window. For a long time, he said nothing, just stood there, staring out into the vast expanse of the estate. The silence stretched on, and Sophie could feel her anxiety building. She needed to get out of this room, to put some distance between herself and him. Every time they spoke, every time he looked at her like he was searching for something human in her, it became harder to maintain the facade. She couldn't afford to let him get too close. If he figured out that she wasn't what she claimed to be, it would be over. Not just her job, but everything. The debt, the legal troubles, all of it would come crashing back down on her. Finally, James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wish you were something else?" Sophie's heart froze. He wasn't asking the robot this question. He was asking her. The man standing by the window, the genius billionaire, was letting his mask slip, revealing a glimpse of a lonely, broken person underneath. And he was asking her a question that cut far too close to home. She fought the urge to respond with the truth. "Yes, I wish I were someone else. I wish I hadn't made the choices that led me here. I wish I could escape this mess." But she couldn't say any of that. "I do not experience wishes or desires, Mr. Morgan," she said mechanically, keeping her voice flat. "I am here to assist you." James turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Then, as if a switch had flipped, James's face hardened. He straightened his posture, The vulnerability that had been there moments ago, disappearing behind his usual wall of control. "Right," he said, his voice cold again. "You're a machine. You don't feel anything." Sophie could see the disappointment in his eyes, but she couldn't afford to respond to it. She had to stay in character, no matter how much it hurt to see him shut himself off like that. "You can go," he said, waving her away dismissively. "I'll call you when I need you again." Sophie nodded and turned to leave, her heart pounding as she walked toward the door. She could feel his eyes on her as she left, the weight of his scrutiny following her until she was out of the room. As soon as the door closed behind her, Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clenched them into fists, trying to regain her composure. "You're slipping," she told herself. "You're letting him get to you." But how could she not? The man she had been sent here to deceive was more broken than she had expected, more vulnerable than the cold exterior he presented to the world. And the more she saw of that side of him, the harder it became to maintain her lie. As Sophie walked back to her room, she realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a test of her ability to play a role. This was a test of her ability to hold herself together. And with each passing day, that was becoming harder to do. The days in James Morgan's mansion followed a rigid, calculated routine, each moment measured by the quiet hum of machines and the cold efficiency of technology. Sophie had settled into the rhythm of the house, performing her tasks flawlessly, without hesitation. It was a delicate dance, every movement, every response calculated to maintain the illusion that she was nothing more than a machine, a tool at James's disposal. But despite her outward calm, Sophie's mind was constantly racing. The growing complexity of her interactions with James made it harder to separate her true self from the robotic persona she had crafted. His probing questions, his moments of vulnerability, his constant scrutiny, it was all becoming too much. The weight of maintaining the facade was pressing down on her like never before. And then, inevitably, she made her first mistake. It started as a seemingly ordinary morning. Sophie had completed her assigned tasks, overseeing the security systems, adjusting the temperature controls, and monitoring the house's automated systems. Everything was going smoothly. James had been distant that day, absorbed in his work as usual, barely acknowledging her presence. But by late afternoon, something shifted. Sophie was in the study, organizing a series of files on the holographic display when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't need to turn to know it was James. His presence was always distinct, a mix of authority and quiet intensity that filled the room before he even spoke. "Sophie," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I need your assistance with something." She turned toward him, her face expressionless, waiting for his instructions. James gestured to the display. "There's an anomaly in the data I've been working on. I need you to run a diagnostic and identify the problem." Sophie nodded mechanically and stepped forward, her fingers moving quickly over the interface. The data James had pulled up was complex, filled with layers of code and intricate patterns that only someone with advanced knowledge of AI could decipher. As she worked, she felt James's gaze on her, watching her every move with that familiar intensity. It took several minutes for Sophie to sift through the information, but eventually, she located the error. It was a minor glitch, something easily fixed with a quick adjustment to the code. She moved to correct it when James's voice cut through the silence. "Stop." Sophie froze, her hand hovering over the display. She hadn't expected him to interrupt. James stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the data. "What did you just do?" Her mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "He's testing you. Don't slip up." "I identified a minor error in the code," she replied evenly. "I was correcting it." James's gaze flicked from the screen to her, suspicion clouding his expression. "How did you identify the error so quickly?" Sophie felt her pulse quicken. "You're a machine. You're supposed to be able to analyze data quickly." But something in his tone told her this wasn't just about speed. There was something else at play here, something more subtle. "I am programmed to analyze and process large amounts of data efficiently," she answered, her voice carefully modulated. James took another step toward her, his eyes locked on hers. "Yes, but this data is more complex than the routine tasks I've assigned you. It's highly specialized, and yet you identified the problem almost instantly." Sophie swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for a response. She had grown too comfortable, too confident in her role. She hadn't expected James to notice the subtle difference in her performance, but of course he had. He was always watching, always analyzing, and she had just made a critical error. James's voice softened, but the intensity behind it remained. Machines don't anticipate. They don't understand intent. They follow instructions. But you... He trailed off, his gaze searching hers for something, a crack, a tell, anything that might reveal what he suspected. Sophie stood perfectly still, her mind a blur of panic and strategy. She needed to recover, to pull herself back into character before the situation spiraled out of control. But James was too close, too focused on her, and she could feel the fragile facade beginning to crack. "I was following the diagnostic protocol you provided," she said, her voice steady. "The error was a simple one, easily detected by my systems." James didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, he turned away, walking back to his desk. For a moment, Sophie thought she had passed the test, that he had let it go. But then he spoke again, his voice low and calculating. "Run the diagnostic again," he said without looking at her. Sophie's heart sank. He's not letting this go. She turned back to the display, her hands moving mechanically over the interface as she began the diagnostic process again. But this time, she could feel James's eyes on her, watching every move with an intensity that made her skin crawl. As the diagnostic ran, Sophie forced herself to remain calm. She had made a mistake, but she could still recover. She just had to play her part perfectly, to stay within the parameters of the machine she was pretending to be. Machines didn't make intuitive leaps. They didn't analyze intent. They followed strict protocols, and that's what she needed to do now. The diagnostic completed, revealing the same minor error as before. Sophie pointed to the display, her voice carefully neutral. "The error remains in the same subroutine. Would you like me to proceed with the correction?" James didn't answer immediately. He approached the display, studying the data with a critical eye. His hand hovered over the interface, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Do you ever wonder why I've never allowed anyone to see this project?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. This wasn't about the data anymore. It wasn't about the diagnostic or the error in the code. James was testing her in a different way now, probing deeper than she had expected. "I do not experience curiosity, Mr. Morgan," she replied, her voice robotic. "I am here to assist you in whatever capacity you require." James smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Of course, machines don't experience curiosity, or doubt, or fear. He took another step toward her, closing the distance between them. Sophie's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain still. He was too close now, too focused on her. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. "But you see," James continued, his voice soft but intense, "I do. I've spent my entire life surrounded by machines, by systems designed to work flawlessly. And yet, no matter how perfect they are, there's always something missing." Sophie didn't respond. She couldn't. She could feel the tension in the room thickening, could feel James's words closing in on her like a trap. "People are messy," he said, his eyes searching hers. "They're unpredictable, unreliable. But that's what makes them real. Machines, on the other hand, they do exactly what they're told. They follow orders. They don't think for themselves." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "But you're different. You're too good at what you do." Sophie's chest tightened. He's figured it out. He knows. James took one final step toward her, closing the gap completely. His eyes bored into hers, as though he could see through the carefully constructed facade she had built. "What are you, Sophie? What are you really?" Her mind screamed for an answer, but none came. The truth was right there, teetering on the edge of exposure, and she had no idea how to stop it from spilling out. "I am your assistant, Mr. Morgan," she said slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am designed to meet your needs and perform my tasks efficiently." James stared at her for a long moment, the tension between them unbearable. Then, without warning, he stepped back, his expression hardening. "We'll see about that." He turned away, dismissing her without another word. The weight of his suspicion hung in the air as Sophie stood there, her heart racing, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She had come so close to being exposed, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up. As she left the room, the cold corridors of the mansion seemed even more oppressive than before. James Morgan was getting too close, and Sophie knew that her first mistake might very well be her last. Sophie's footsteps echoed softly as she retreated down the corridor, the cold air of James Morgan's mansion pressing in on her. She felt a weight in her chest that she couldn't shake, a gnawing anxiety that twisted her stomach with every step. She had come too close to the edge today, too close to breaking the illusion. James had pushed her harder than ever, probing her with questions, testing her reactions, and she had nearly faltered. The memory of his voice, sharp and suspicious, echoed in her mind. "You're too good at what you do." His words had been a warning, a clear sign that he was beginning to doubt the seamlessness of her performance. The calculated, perfect responses she had trained for responses meant to convince him she was a machine were starting to work against her. James didn't trust perfection. He didn't believe in things that worked too flawlessly. The very efficiency she had thought would keep her safe was now making him suspicious. As she reached the door to her room, Sophie paused, pressing her back against the cold wall for a moment, trying to catch her breath. She had been walking this razor's edge since the moment she arrived at the mansion, but now the line was becoming impossibly thin. How much longer could she keep this up before James discovered the truth? She stepped inside her room and closed the door, the sterile silence of the space doing nothing to calm her racing thoughts. For a long time, she stood there, staring at the stark walls, the monitors that blinked with data, and the small, uncomfortable bed where she had spent so many sleepless nights. Everything in this house was designed to maintain control, precision, just like the man who lived here. Sophie sank down onto the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. What am I going to do? The pressure was building with each passing day, and she was running out of ways to stay ahead of James's growing suspicion. He was pushing her harder, watching her more closely, and today, she had made a mistake. One slip, one intuitive leap that no machine would have made, and James had latched onto it like a predator sensing weakness. She replayed the moment in her mind, over and over, trying to figure out where she had gone wrong. She had been too quick with the diagnostic, too efficient in fixing the code. That was it. She had let her human instincts take over, thinking like an engineer, not like a machine. And James had noticed. The worst part was that she could see the toll it was taking on him, too. James was unraveling in his own way, his isolation and obsession with control eating away at him. He was haunted by something deeper than just his condition. Sophie could feel it in his voice, see it in the way he paced his office late into the night. And now, he was channeling that frustration into testing her, as if finding a flaw in her would confirm something about his own existence. But she couldn't afford to empathize with him. Not now, not when the stakes were so high. Sophie closed her eyes, leaning back against the wall, and tried to calm the rising tide of fear inside her. She needed to refocus. She couldn't afford another mistake like today. The next time James tested her, she would need to be perfect, not in the way that made him suspicious, but in a way that felt fallible, imperfect, human. But how do you pretend to be a perfect machine by being imperfect? The thought twisted in her mind, a paradox she hadn't anticipated when she had agreed to this insane charade. The next morning, Sophie was summoned to James's office earlier than usual. She had barely finished running through her routines when Alpha, the house's AI assistant, alerted her to the request. James wanted her in his private workshop, a part of the mansion she had never been allowed into before. Her stomach tightened as she made her way through the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion. She had long wondered what James worked on in his private workshop, the space that even Alpha didn't monitor. The fact that he was calling her there now meant something had shifted. Was he going to push her even harder today? Test her limits further? The thought filled her with dread, but she had no choice but to comply. When Sophie reached the door to the workshop, it slid open silently, revealing a large, dimly lit room filled with machines, blueprints, and half-finished projects. The air was heavy with the scent of metal and grease, a stark contrast to the pristine atmosphere of the rest of the mansion. This was James's sanctuary, the place where he let his control slip just enough to immerse himself in his work. James was already inside, standing over a large workbench cluttered with tools and components. His back was to her, his posture tense. Sophie stepped inside, her movements deliberate and measured, though her heart pounded with every step. "You're here," James said without turning around. His voice was strained, as if he had been up all night working on something. "I need your help with a new project." Sophie nodded, her expression neutral. "I am ready to assist, Mr. Morgan." James finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He gestured to the workbench, where several mechanical parts lay scattered. "I've been working on something new, something different from my usual projects." Sophie glanced at the parts, recognizing some of them immediately as components for a new type of AI interface. But there was something unusual about the way they were arranged, as if this project wasn't just about creating another machine. James noticed her looking and raised an eyebrow. "What do you think it is?" The question caught her off guard. Machines didn't speculate. They didn't offer opinions unless asked directly. But this was another one of James's tests. He was pushing her again, trying to find a crack in her responses. Sophie's mind raced. She had to respond, but not in a way that made her seem too intuitive. "It appears to be a new AI interface," she said cautiously, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps designed for enhanced interaction." James's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the workbench. "You're not wrong," he muttered, "but it's more than that." He picked up one of the components, turning it over in his hands. "I've spent my entire career designing systems that follow orders, that perform perfectly. But what if perfection isn't the goal? What if the key is imperfection?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Imperfection? Was James talking about machines? Or was this another veiled reference to himself? James placed the component back on the table and looked at her again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about adaptation. Machines aren't supposed to adapt on their own, but maybe they should." Sophie stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. He was walking a fine line between talking about his work and talking about her, or rather, the version of her he believed was a machine. "I want you to help me with this," James said finally. "I want to see how far we can push this idea of adaptability." Sophie nodded mechanically. "I will assist in any way I can, Mr. Morgan." James watched her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, you will. But this time, I'm not going to give you direct instructions. I want you to figure it out on your own. I want to see how you approach the problem." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Figure it out on my own?" Machines didn't do that. They followed instructions, performed tasks within the parameters they were given. James was pushing her into dangerous territory, testing the limits of her facade in a way she hadn't anticipated. But she couldn't refuse. She had no choice but to play along. Sophie stepped forward, her hands moving over the components as she examined them. She could feel James watching her, his eyes following her every movement, searching for any sign that she was something more than she appeared to be. Her mind raced as she tried to think like a machine, to act as though she was processing data without the intuitive leaps a human would make. For the next hour, she worked in silence, adjusting the components, running diagnostics, and carefully testing the limits of the system James had designed. All the while, he stood nearby, watching her with that same intensity that made her skin crawl. She couldn't tell if he was satisfied with her performance or if his suspicions were growing stronger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spoke. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice low. "You approach problems in a way that's different from the others." Sophie's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I am designed to adapt, Mr. Morgan," she said, repeating the same line she had used before. James nodded slowly, but his eyes remained sharp. "Yes, but there's something else, isn't there?" Sophie froze. What does he mean? What does he see? For a long moment, James said nothing, his gaze piercing through her. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the tension in the room broke. He stepped away from the workbench, his posture relaxing slightly. "That will be all for now," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Sophie nodded and quickly exited the workshop, her heart racing as she walked down the corridor. She had survived another test, but just barely. James was pushing her harder, probing deeper into her behavior, and she knew that the next time, she might not be so lucky. The cracks in her facade were growing, and soon, they might shatter. Sophie barely made it to her room before collapsing onto the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The tension from the hours spent in James's private workshop still lingered in her bones, the air thick with the memory of his probing gaze. She had survived another round of his unrelenting scrutiny, but it had been far too close. James wasn't just testing her anymore, he was searching for something he wasn't even sure existed, but couldn't stop looking for. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees and burying her face in her hands. The cracks in her facade were growing wider with each interaction. James wasn't satisfied with her responses anymore, wasn't convinced by her mechanical perfection. He was starting to want more from her, more than she could possibly give while maintaining the illusion. Every time she adapted too well, every time she processed too quickly, he became more suspicious. "You're running out of time," Sophie thought, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can't keep this up much longer." She had been so focused on fooling him with her robotic efficiency that she hadn't anticipated how deeply he would dig. She thought her flawless performance would reassure him, but it was having the opposite effect. James didn't trust perfection. He thrived on control, on finding flaws, and when there weren't any, it drove him deeper into his obsession. And the way he looked at her now, like he was trying to crack open her shell and see if there was something more underneath, that terrified her. The room felt stifling, the walls too close, the air too still. Sophie stood up abruptly, pacing the small space. "Think, Sophie. How do you make a machine more human without revealing yourself?" She needed a new strategy. The tension between them had escalated to the point where she knew she couldn't continue as she had been. If she kept operating like the perfect machine, James would only become more suspicious. She had to give him something else, something that would make her seem more flawed, more human, ironically. But there was a danger in that as well. The more she acted human, the more he might begin to see her for what she really was. What's worse, being too perfect or too imperfect? The question gnawed at her as she paced the room, her mind racing. She barely slept that night, her thoughts tangled with plans and strategies, trying to figure out how to walk the delicate line between being too perfect and being too flawed. By the time the morning light filtered into the room, Sophie felt more exhausted than ever. But there was no time for rest. James would summon her again, as he always did, and she had to be ready. That morning, Sophie was back in the workshop. James had requested her presence again, and this time, the tension in the air was palpable the moment she stepped through the door. He was standing by the workbench, his posture rigid, his expression harder than usual. The half-finished AI project from the previous day lay scattered across the table, its components gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. But James wasn't looking at the project. He was looking at her. "Close the door," he said quietly, his voice laced with an edge Sophie hadn't heard before. Sophie complied, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss behind her. The click of the lock sounded unnaturally loud in the heavy silence that followed. She turned to face James, keeping her expression blank, her posture calm, but inside, her heart was racing. James studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning her face, her body, as though he were looking for any sign of something out of place. Sophie stood perfectly still, waiting, her mind screaming at her to stay in character, to hold the line. "I've been thinking," James said finally, his voice low, almost contemplative, "about what it means to be human, about the flaws, the imperfections that make people unpredictable." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "And about you." Sophie's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "He's testing you. He's always testing you. Don't slip up. I am here to assist you, Mr. Morgan," she said in her carefully modulated tone. "My programming is designed to adapt to your needs." James smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, I know. You've been flawless in that regard." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Too flawless, perhaps." Sophie's heart raced. He knows. He's getting closer. He walked around the workbench, slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling its prey. Sophie's mind raced, but her body remained still, her expression neutral. She couldn't give him any reason to doubt her further. Not now. James stopped in front of her, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do you know what happens when machines are too perfect? When they operate without any margin for error." Sophie kept her voice steady. "They perform their tasks efficiently and without failure. James raised an eyebrow. Yes, but that's the problem, isn't it? Perfection isn't relatable. It's not human. Sophie said nothing, her mind a blur of fear and strategy. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, pressing down on her like a physical force. He was pushing her, testing her in ways that went beyond the technical. He wasn't just looking for a flaw in her performance. He was looking for something deeper, something real. I've spent my whole life trying to perfect machines, James said, his voice soft but intense. Trying to make them more like us, without all the chaos that comes with being human. But no matter how advanced they are, they always lack something. Something that can't be programmed. His eyes locked onto hers, and Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. Emotion. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Don't react. Stay in character. I do not experience emotion, Mr. Morgan, she said evenly. I am here to serve. James's smile faded. No, that's what I thought too. But now I'm not so sure. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're different. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face expressionless. She couldn't let him see her fear, her confusion. She had to remain the machine, no matter what. James reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, as though he was daring himself to touch her. Machines don't hesitate. They don't make decisions based on instinct or intuition. And yet, sometimes it feels like you do. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. He's testing me again. He's trying to make me react. I follow the parameters you set for me, she said softly, her voice as calm as she could make it. My actions are based on the data and instructions you provide. James shook his head, a faint look of frustration crossing his face. Maybe that's true, but there's something else. Something I can't explain. He stepped back, turning away from her abruptly and pacing across the room. Sophie stood in silence, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, her mind spinning. She couldn't afford to make another mistake, but it was becoming harder and harder to maintain control. James was pushing her to the edge, and she could feel the cracks in her facade widening with every word he spoke. After a long, tense silence, James stopped pacing and turned to face her again. His expression was hard, his eyes sharp with suspicion. I'm going to run a test, he said suddenly. Sophie froze. A test? What kind of test? I want to see how far your adaptability goes. James continued, his voice cold. I've been thinking about the limits of machine learning. How far a system can push itself before it fails. Sophie's mind raced. She didn't know what kind of test he was planning, but she knew it would be dangerous. He was no longer satisfied with observing her. He was going to push her to her limits and beyond. James walked over to the console, tapping a few commands into the interface. The room's lights dimmed, and the holographic display flickered to life, filling the space with a series of codes and sequences. Sophie stood perfectly still, her heart racing, as she watched James work. I've set up a scenario, James said, his voice calm but intense. A complex problem that even the most advanced AI systems struggle with. I want to see how you handle it. Sophie stepped forward, her hands moving over the console as the scenario loaded. The screen filled with layers of data, algorithms, and patterns, all designed to push her computational abilities to their limits. She could feel James's eyes on her as she began to analyze the problem, her mind racing to keep up with the complexity of the task. For the next hour, she worked in silence, her fingers moving quickly over the interface as she tried to solve the puzzle James had set before her. The pressure was immense, the complexity of the task far beyond anything she had encountered before. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep going, had to prove that she could handle whatever he threw at her. James watched her the entire time, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with focus. He was waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to reveal something that would confirm his suspicions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophie completed the task. The screen blinked with the results, the problem solved, the data perfectly analyzed. She stood back, her heart pounding in her chest, as she waited for James's reaction. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Impressive, he said quietly. But now I have more questions than answers. Sophie felt her stomach drop. What does he mean? James took a step toward her, his voice low. You're different, Sophie, and I'm going to find out why. Sophie left James's workshop that day shaken to her core. His words echoed in her mind, over and over. You're different, Sophie, and I'm going to find out why. Her hands trembled as she walked through the sterile corridors of the mansion, each step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He knew. Maybe he didn't know exactly what she was hiding yet, but James was no longer merely suspicious, he was determined to uncover the truth. His intensity was growing with each passing day, and Sophie could feel the walls closing in around her. As she reached her room and closed the door behind her, she collapsed onto the bed, her body sagging with exhaustion. The hours she had spent working on his impossible test had pushed her to her limit, not just intellectually, but emotionally. She had solved the problem, just as James had asked, but now she wondered if that had been a mistake. Solving it so quickly, so flawlessly, had only deepened his suspicions. How much longer can I keep this up? The question gnawed at her as she lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling. Every day, the pressure mounted, and she was running out of ways to stay ahead of James's scrutiny. She could feel the cracks widening, the thin veneer of her robotic persona beginning to slip under the weight of his constant watchfulness. I need to stay calm, Sophie told herself. I need to be smarter about this. If I panic, if I make one wrong move. But how could she stay calm when she knew James was planning his next move? He was testing her at every turn, and now he was going to take even more drastic measures to expose her. She had seen it in his eyes, heard it in his voice, the calm, calculated tone that masked the storm of obsession brewing underneath. The next morning came too soon. Sophie hadn't slept. She had spent the night in a state of restless tension, her mind spinning with scenarios, trying to anticipate James's next move. Every possible outcome led to the same conclusion. Sooner or later, he would discover the truth. And then what? What would happen when James finally realized that the robot he had been testing was a human? Would he be angry? Betrayed? Would he throw her out, exposing her to the legal and financial disasters she had been hiding from? Or would it be worse, would he see her deception as something far more personal? The thought made Sophie's skin crawl. James wasn't just a brilliant, reclusive billionaire. He was a man who craved control, who needed things to operate in a specific, orderly way. Her presence in his home, her role as his assistant, was part of that carefully controlled environment. If he discovered that she had been lying to him, manipulating him, you can't let him find out. The thought surged through her with renewed urgency. You have to stay ahead of him. James didn't summon her that morning, and the silence only made Sophie more anxious. Normally, by this time, Alpha would have instructed her to report to one of James's rooms, or James himself would have sent a direct command. But today, there was nothing. Sophie spent the morning going through her tasks in the quiet stillness of the mansion, her mind racing with thoughts of what James was planning. The calm before the storm. He was giving her space, perhaps intentionally, allowing her to worry, to stew in her own uncertainty. By midday, the silence became unbearable. Sophie decided to head to the kitchen, hoping to distract herself with something mundane, something that would take her mind off the tension of the last few days. She had to keep moving, keep doing something, anything, to avoid the creeping dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. As she entered the kitchen, she was surprised to see James already there, seated at the long, sleek counter. He was staring at a cup of coffee, though he hadn't touched it. The air around him felt thick with unspoken tension. Sophie froze for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. She hadn't expected to find him here. James rarely used the kitchen himself. He preferred to have his meals prepared by the house's automated systems. But today, there he was sitting in silence, lost in thought. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sharp and direct. Sophie forced herself to maintain her robotic composure, keeping her expression neutral as she walked toward the counter. "Mr. Morgan," she said evenly, "how may I assist you?" James didn't respond immediately. He continued to watch her, his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were evaluating something, perhaps her, perhaps the situation. Sophie felt her pulse quicken under his scrutiny, but she kept her movements deliberate and controlled. After a long pause, James finally spoke, his voice low and contemplative. "Sophie, do you ever wonder why I chose you?" Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind racing to process the question. What does he mean? She had been under the impression that this entire situation had been orchestrated by Eliza and James's team, that she had been chosen because of her unique skills and because of her desperate situation. But now, as James asked the question, it seemed as though there was more to it. I do not experience curiosity, Mr. Morgan, she replied, keeping her voice neutral. I am here to perform the tasks you require of me. James smiled faintly, though it was a hollow, humorless smile. Yes, of course. That's what you're programmed to say. He picked up the coffee cup and took a small sip, his gaze never leaving hers. But I'm not asking what you're programmed to do. I'm asking if you've ever thought about it. Why I chose you. Why you're different from the others. Sophie's chest tightened. He's digging again. This wasn't just idle conversation. James was probing, pushing her boundaries once more. I am here to meet your specific needs, she said carefully, to adapt to your preferences and environment. James set the cup down with a soft clink, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of the mug. Do you ever think about what would happen if you weren't perfect? If you made a mistake? Sophie's heart raced. The question struck too close to home, and she could feel the panic rising in her chest. Does he know? Was this it? Was this the moment when James would finally expose her? I am programmed to avoid errors, Sophie replied, her voice calm, though it took everything in her not to let the fear creep into her tone. James tilted his head slightly, studying her. Yes, but what if you did make one? He paused, letting the question hang in the air between them. What if you failed? Sophie's mind screamed at her to stay in character, to keep her responses measured and robotic. But the intensity of his gaze was overwhelming, and for the first time, she felt her control slipping. I do not experience failure, Mr. Morgan, she said softly, but the words felt hollow, weak. James stood up suddenly, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked around the counter, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. Sophie remained still, her body rigid, but her mind was in overdrive. What is he doing? What is he going to do? When James stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His expression had hardened, his eyes darker than usual. There was something dangerous in the way he looked at her now, something that made Sophie's skin prickle with fear. What are you hiding, Sophie? James asked, his voice low and sharp. Her heart stopped. For a split second, Sophie considered running, fleeing from the room, from the mansion, from the entire situation. But she knew that would only confirm his suspicions. Instead, she forced herself to stay calm, to maintain the robotic composure she had perfected over the last few weeks. I am not hiding anything, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice soft but steady. I am here to serve you. James's eyes bore into hers, as if he were trying to see past the facade, trying to tear down the walls she had so carefully constructed. He took another step closer, and Sophie could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Everyone hides something, he murmured. Even machines. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Sophie could feel the tension building, feel James's suspicion tightening like a noose around her neck. And for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she realized just how close she was to being exposed. I won't let you fail, James said quietly, his voice taking on a strange, almost possessive edge. Not until I figure out what makes you different. Sophie's chest tightened. He's not going to stop. James turned away, his expression unreadable, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Sophie stood frozen in place, her mind racing. The cracks were widening, and James was closing in. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, or what would happen when the facade finally crumbled. Sophie stood in the kitchen long after James had left, her body frozen in place, her mind spiraling in every direction. The words he had spoken to her moments before echoed in her thoughts, each syllable a knife, twisting deeper. I won't let you fail. Not until I figure out what makes you different. The tension between them was no longer a matter of suspicion. It had become something darker, something that felt like obsession. James wasn't just curious about her. He was consumed by the need to uncover what lay beneath her surface. Every conversation, every test, every question was his way of peeling back the layers, trying to reveal what she had so desperately tried to hide. And she was running out of time. Sophie's breath came in shallow bursts as she paced the kitchen, her mind scrambling for a way to regain control of the situation. What now? What is he going to do next? The line she had been walking between human and machine was becoming impossible to maintain. She had thought she could convince James that she was nothing more than a highly advanced robot. But now he was pushing her beyond what she could handle, testing her limits in ways she hadn't anticipated. She couldn't keep this up. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the countertop, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. You have to think, Sophie. You have to find a way out of this before it's too late. But what was her escape? The debts, the legal trouble, everything she had run from it all came crashing back in her mind. She had come to James's mansion because she had no other choice, but now it felt like a trap she couldn't escape. If James discovered the truth, if he realized that she wasn't the flawless machine he believed her to be, everything would come crumbling down. He would expose her, and with that, all the safety she had found in this bizarre deception would be gone. The very thought made her stomach churn. Sophie turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps soft against the marble floors as she headed back to her room. She needed to think, to plan her next move, but as she made her way through the quiet corridors, her mind felt clouded with anxiety. Every decision she had made since coming here now seeming fragile and reckless. The days that followed were agonizing. James didn't summon her immediately after that unsettling conversation in the kitchen. Instead, he let her stew in the uncertainty, allowing the silence to fester like an open wound. It was as if he were giving her space, time to wonder what his next move would be. Sophie hated it, the waiting, the not knowing. The mansion, once simply a cold and distant place, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying her every anxious thought. She went through her daily tasks, managing the house's systems and security, but her mind was never fully present. Every moment was consumed by the knowledge that James was plotting something, that he was preparing for another test, another push to expose her. And every time Alpha's voice echoed through the halls, announcing a request from James, Sophie's heart would seize, wondering if this would be the moment everything unraveled. It was almost a relief when James finally called for her again. Sophie entered the living room, the large glass windows casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. James was already there, seated in an armchair, his eyes fixed on a holographic display floating in the air before him. The display flickered with lines of code and complex blueprints, but James wasn't focused on the technical details. His gaze was distant, thoughtful, as if he were contemplating something far more abstract. When Sophie approached, James glanced up, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit across from him, and Sophie did so, keeping her posture perfectly controlled, her face blank. She didn't know what this was about, but the tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just another routine interaction. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest. Do you know why I've been pushing you so hard lately? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of something sharper. Sophie hesitated for the briefest of moments. I am here to meet your expectations, Mr. Morgan, she replied, falling back on the robotic phrases she had been using for weeks. James's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, I know. You keep saying that. He paused, watching her carefully. But I think we both know that's not really true, don't we? Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay composed. He's testing you again. Stay calm. I am here to assist you in any way you require, she repeated, keeping her voice steady. James leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. I've been thinking a lot about you, Sophie, about how different you are from the other systems I've worked with, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something more going on here. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. Don't let him see it. Don't give anything away. You're too adaptable, James continued, his voice quiet but intense. Too intuitive. Machines don't operate like that. They follow their programming, they process data based on strict parameters. But you act more like he stopped himself, the words hanging in the air between them. Sophie didn't move, didn't react. She couldn't afford to. James stood up abruptly, turning away from her to pace the room. His movements were sharp, filled with a tension she hadn't seen in him before. It was clear he was struggling with something beyond the technical, beyond the rational. The controlled exterior he usually maintained was slipping. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face her again, his expression hard. "I want to run a new test," he said, his voice tight. "A more personal one." Sophie's stomach dropped. "A personal test? What does he mean?" James crossed the room and sat down in the chair opposite hers once more, leaning forward. His eyes locked onto hers with a force that made Sophie's breath catch in her throat. "I've built machines my whole life," he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I've perfected systems that operate flawlessly. But people are imperfect. They make mistakes. They hesitate. They second-guess themselves." Sophie's chest tightened. "Where is this going?" James's gaze bore into her, as though he were trying to peel away her robotic mask, layer by layer. "So I want to see something. I want to see how far your programming goes. I want to see how human you can be." Sophie's heart raced. "He's setting a trap. He knows I'm not what I say I am. I'm going to create a situation," James continued, his voice cold and deliberate, "where you'll have to choose. And I want to see how you handle it." Sophie swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't just another test. This was something far more dangerous. James wasn't satisfied with observing her behavior anymore. He wanted to push her to the breaking point, to see if she would reveal the truth under pressure. "What do you mean, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm and robotic as she could manage. James smiled faintly, but there was no kindness in it. "You'll see soon enough." For the rest of the day, Sophie couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that clung to her like a dark cloud. James hadn't given her any more details about his test, but she knew it was coming. And whatever it was designed to push her beyond her limits, to expose her for what she truly was. Every moment felt like a countdown to disaster. Sophie tried to prepare herself, running through scenarios in her mind, trying to anticipate what James might throw at her. But the uncertainty was maddening. She had no idea what he was planning, no way to predict how he would try to manipulate her. As the hours passed, the tension in the mansion grew unbearable. Sophie moved through her tasks like a ghost, her mind constantly alert, waiting for the moment when James would spring his trap. Every time she saw him, every time she heard Alpha's voice, her heart would race, her breath would catch, and she would brace herself for whatever was coming. But the day passed without incident. James didn't summon her again, didn't mention the test, and Sophie was left in a state of constant anxiety, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. It wasn't until late that night, when the mansion was silent and dark, that Sophie finally realized the true nature of James's plan. She had been lying in bed, her thoughts a chaotic mess, when she heard a soft chime from the door. It slid open a moment later, revealing Alpha standing in the hallway, its cold, emotionless voice breaking the silence. "Mr. Morgan has requested your presence in the workshop." Sophie's heart seized in her chest. "It's happening." With trembling hands, she stood up and followed Alpha through the darkened corridors of the mansion, her mind reeling with dread. She didn't know what awaited her in the workshop, but she knew this was at the moment when James would make his move. When she entered the workshop, the door slid shut behind her, and the room was bathed in a dim, eerie light. James stood near the workbench, his back to her, his posture tense. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Tonight, we find out what you really are." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "It's over." Sophie's heart thundered in her chest, as the door to James's workshop sealed behind her with a quiet hiss. The dim light in the room seemed to press in on her, casting eerie shadows across the scattered tools and machinery. James stood at the workbench, his back to her, unmoving, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. It felt like the air itself had thickened, every second dragging out into eternity as Sophie braced herself for whatever was about to come. James's words echoed in her mind. "Tonight, we find out what you really are." She stood frozen near the door, forcing herself to remain composed, even as her mind screamed at her to run. Her chest tightened with every breath she took, the weight of impending disaster bearing down on her. There would be no more games, no more tests designed to toy with her. This was at the moment when everything she had been hiding would come to light. James finally turned to face her, his expression sharp and unreadable. His dark eyes, which usually held a certain cold detachment, now burned with an intensity that sent a chill down Sophie's spine. This wasn't the man she had been dealing with for weeks, the one who had hidden his vulnerabilities behind his obsession with perfection. This was someone different, someone on the edge of discovery and eager to rip through the lies that had surrounded him. There's no point in pretending anymore, is there? James's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. You're not what you claim to be, Sophie. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to remain still. Stay calm. Stay in character. Don't give anything away. I am here to assist you, Mr. Morgan, she replied, her voice steady but mechanical. James's lips curved into a bitter smile, one filled with frustration and a hint of something darker. You've said that before, but I'm not asking for assistance. I'm asking for the truth. He took a step closer, the faint sound of his footsteps against the polished floor sending ripples of dread through her. Sophie fought the urge to back away, to distance herself from the intensity of his gaze. James was done with subtlety. This was a direct confrontation. The truth, Sophie repeated, keeping her tone neutral, robotic. I am fulfilling my role, Mr. Morgan. His eyes narrowed. Are you? Then explain this to me. James reached over to the workbench and activated the holographic display. Lines of code and diagnostics flickered to life in the air between them, a sea of data that Sophie recognized immediately. It was the problem she had solved days ago, the test that had pushed her too close to revealing herself. This shouldn't have been possible for you to solve, not like that. No machine could have identified the issue that quickly, and certainly not in the way you did. So, tell me, Sophie, how did you do it? Sophie's mind raced. This is the moment. She could feel it. Her carefully constructed facade was hanging by a thread, and with one wrong word, it would all come crashing down. I followed the diagnostic protocol, she answered, her voice betraying none of the panic that surged through her. My programming allows for adaptability based on your instructions. James shook his head, his expression hardening. No, that's not good enough. Adaptability has limits. There's something else going on here, something you're hiding, and I'm going to find out what it is. Sophie felt her throat tighten. He's not going to stop. She had to think, to find a way to deflect his suspicions, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Her mind raced through the possible outcomes, none of them good. He had her cornered, and she knew it. James crossed the room in 2 quick strides, stopping directly in front of her. His eyes locked onto hers with a force that made her stomach twist. Machines don't lie, Sophie. They don't hide things. But people do. Sophie swallowed hard, the pressure building inside her like a storm ready to break. You have to stay in character. If you admit anything, it's over. I am not hiding anything, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice unwavering. I am designed to fulfill my role. James stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence between them was thick with tension, each second dragging out as Sophie fought to maintain her composure. And then, without warning, James's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. The sudden contact sent a shockwave through Sophie's system, her body going rigid as his fingers wrapped around her arm. It was the first time he had ever touched her, and the unexpectedness of it nearly shattered the control she had worked so hard to maintain. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as the realization hit her. He was testing her in a way that no machine would react to. James's grip tightened, his eyes boring into hers. Do you feel that, Sophie? Sophie froze, her mind screaming at her to remain still, to act like a machine, unresponsive to physical touch. But her heart was pounding so hard in her chest that she was certain James could hear it. You're human. He'll know. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ragged breathing she could barely control. Then, slowly, she forced herself to respond, her voice cold and emotionless. I do not feel, Mr. Morgan. James's eyes flashed with something unreadable, a mixture of frustration and triumph. He released her wrist, stepping back, his expression dark. You don't feel, huh? He turned away from her, pacing the room, his movements sharp with agitation. Machines don't feel pain. They don't react to pressure. But people do. And I'm going to prove it. Sophie's heart sank. What does he mean? What is he planning? James stopped in front of the workbench, his hand hovering over the control panel. You've been playing this game for weeks now, pretending to be something you're not. I've given you the benefit of the doubt, hoping that you would reveal yourself in time. But I see now that you won't." Sophie took a step forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Morgan, No," James interrupted, his voice sharp. "No more lies." He pressed a button on the control panel, and the lights in the room dimmed. The hum of the machines around them grew louder, and Sophie felt a wave of dread wash over her. "I've set up a scenario," James said, his voice low and dangerous. "A real test, one that no machine can pass." Sophie's pulse quickened, panic rising in her chest. What is he going to do? The holographic display shifted, showing a series of complex calculations and data streams. James's fingers flew over the controls, his movements precise and deliberate. Sophie watched in horror as the scenario began to unfold before her, a high-stakes simulation, one that required not just logic and efficiency, but emotional response. It was a trap designed specifically to push her beyond the limits of her facade. "This is it," James said quietly, his voice cold. "This is where we find out if you're really what you say you are." Sophie's heart raced as she stared at the simulation. It was a complex moral problem, a scenario where the outcome would depend entirely on her ability to make decisions based on empathy, on human intuition. No machine could navigate this. It was too abstract, too messy. It required emotion, something Sophie couldn't afford to show. She stepped forward, her hands hovering over the controls. Her mind raced, calculating the possible outcomes, but there was no way to avoid it. James was watching her, waiting for her to fail. For a long, agonizing moment, Sophie stood frozen, staring at the simulation. She could feel James's gaze on her, could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her like a vice. And in that moment, she knew there was no way out. The facade was crumbling. She couldn't keep this up any longer. Slowly, with trembling hands, Sophie began to work through the simulation. Her mind raced as she tried to suppress her instincts, to approach the problem like a machine. But the scenario was designed to test her humanity, to force her to make choices that no robot could make. Each decision felt like a step closer to disaster, each movement a crack in the carefully constructed lie she had built. Sophie's hands shook as she made her way through the scenario, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She could feel the pressure mounting, feel the walls closing in around her. And then finally it happened. The final choice appeared on the screen, a choice that required a sacrifice, a decision that no machine would make. It was a question of empathy, of humanity, and Sophie knew in that moment that the game was over. Her hands hovered over the controls, her heart pounding. She could feel James's eyes on her, waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to reveal herself. "You can't do this. You can't keep pretending." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and she hesitated, her fingers trembling. And in that split second, James knew. He stepped forward, his voice low and cold. "You're not a machine." Sophie's heart shattered. Sophie's world came crashing down the moment James uttered those words. "You're not a machine." For a few agonizing seconds, time seemed to freeze. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Sophie stood paralyzed in front of the control panel, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat. She knew the facade had finally shattered. There was no more pretending, no more calculated responses. James had seen through her, and now there was nothing left to hide behind. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the entire mansion itself had shifted in response to the revelation. Sophie could feel James's eyes on her, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. Her mind raced, but there were no more strategies to consider, no way to salvage the situation. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressed down on her. The debts, the failed career, the impossible choice that had brought her to James's mansion in the first place, it had all been building to this. And now, the truth was laid bare. James took a slow step forward, his expression dark, unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly calm. "How long have you been lying to me?" Sophie opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She stood there, staring at him, her mind screaming for some kind of answer, some explanation that could fix this, but there was nothing. There's no way out. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, there was no hint of the controlled, distant man he had always been. There was anger in his gaze, an edge of betrayal that sent a chill through Sophie's body. "How long?" he repeated, his voice tight with restrained fury. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Since the beginning," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James's jaw clenched, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, as if trying to make sense of what he had just learned. Sophie could see the betrayal flickering in his eyes, could feel the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. Finally, he turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench. His knuckles turned white as he struggled to control his emotions. Sophie stood frozen, not daring to move, her mind racing with a mix of panic and regret. She had known this moment would come eventually, but it didn't make it any easier to face. She had no idea how James would react, and that uncertainty terrified her. For what felt like an eternity, James said nothing. He simply stood there, staring down at the workbench, his breathing heavy. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the machines, a reminder of the cold, calculated world James had built for himself, a world she had just shattered with her lies. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raw. "Why?" Sophie blinked, surprised by the question. She had expected anger, rage, accusations. But this quiet, broken why cut deeper than she had imagined. It was filled with a pain she hadn't expected from him, a vulnerability that caught her off guard. "I didn't have a choice," Sophie said, her voice trembling. I needed the money. I needed to escape." She took a shaky breath, trying to find the right words. "They hired me. Eliza. She knew I was desperate. She said you needed someone, but that you couldn't know I was human." James let out a bitter laugh, though it was devoid of humor. "So, it was all a game. You were never here to help me. You were just playing a role." He turned to face her, his eyes cold. "Did you think you could fool me forever?" Sophie flinched at the accusation, her chest tightening with guilt. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. I didn't want to lie to you, James, but I had no other choice. If I hadn't taken the job, I would have lost everything." James stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he turned away again, walking toward the far end of the workshop. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid, as if he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. Sophie felt a crushing weight settle over her. She had expected this moment to be terrifying, but she hadn't expected it to feel so personal, so devastating. She hadn't realized until now just how much she had come to care about what James thought of her. Somewhere along the way, amidst all the lies and deception, the lines had blurred. And now, standing here, exposed and vulnerable, she realized just how much she had come to see James as more than just her employer. But it didn't matter anymore. She had broken his trust. She had lied to him from the very beginning. "I thought I could trust you," James said quietly, his back still turned to her. "I thought you were different from the others." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Different? The word echoed painfully in her mind. She had spent weeks pretending to be something she wasn't, and now James was telling her that he had believed in her, or at least, in the version of her that she had presented. The guilt clawed at her insides, twisting her gut into knots. "James, I'm sorry," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." James shook his head, letting out a sharp, bitter breath. "You already did." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sophie's chest ached with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. She wanted to explain, to tell James the full truth about why she had taken the job, about the desperation that had driven her to such an extreme. But she knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was done. James finally turned around, his eyes cold and distant once more. The vulnerability that had flickered in the moments before was gone, replaced by the hard exterior he had always used to protect himself. "You need to leave," he said quietly, his voice filled with finality. Sophie's heart sank. "James, please." "Leave," James repeated, more forcefully this time. "Get out of my house. Now." Sophie stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still a shock. She had lost. She had failed. And now, there was nothing left for her here. Without another word, Sophie turned and walked out of the workshop, her legs heavy with the weight of her failure. Each step felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of everything she had worked for, everything she had tried to build. She had been so close to making it through, and now it was all gone. As she made her way through the mansion's corridors, the cold, sterile walls that had once felt like a prison now seemed like the only thing holding her together. Her mind was a blur of emotions: regret, guilt, fear, all tangled together in a knot that threatened to suffocate her. But beneath it all, there was one emotion that she hadn't expected: sadness. She hadn't realized just how much she had come to care for James, not just as the man she was deceiving, but as someone who, like her, was trapped by his circumstances, by his need for control, by the loneliness that had defined his life. And now, she had ruined any chance of reaching him, of breaking through that barrier he had built around himself. Sophie reached her room and shut the door behind her. She stood there for a long time, her back pressed against the door, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't know where to go from here. All she knew was that everything had fallen apart. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, Sophie allowed herself to cry. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, her head resting in her hands as the weight of everything that had just happened crushed her. The quiet of the mansion, once cold but bearable, now felt oppressive, pressing down on her with suffocating force. Her breathing was shallow, and her chest ached with the reality of what had just unraveled. She was going to lose everything. Again. For the longest time, Sophie couldn't bring herself to move. James's words echoed in her mind like a broken record. Leave. His voice had been so final, so filled with betrayal that it still lingered in the room like a ghost. She had known she was playing a dangerous game from the start, but somehow, she had convinced herself she could keep up the charade. She had even begun to believe that she could fool him long enough to escape her own personal demons. But James was too smart, too watchful, and too broken to let anything slip past him for long. "I thought you were different from the others." Sophie winced at the memory of those words. They cut deeper than she wanted to admit because, in some strange, twisted way, she was different. She had come into James's life under false pretenses, yes, but the connection that had developed between them, fragile, complex, and undeniably real, was something she hadn't anticipated. And now, she had destroyed it. She rubbed her temples, trying to clear her mind, but the emotions swirling inside her refused to be pushed down. Guilt gnawed at her insides. Guilt for lying to James, for deceiving him when he had been more vulnerable than she had realized. But it wasn't just guilt. There was sadness, too. A deep, aching sadness that stemmed from the realization that she had come to care for him, and now she had lost him. Sophie stood up, forcing herself to move, to do something. She had to leave. That was clear. James had made it clear that he didn't want her there anymore, and she couldn't blame him. She had broken his trust in a way that couldn't be repaired. Not easily, anyway. She moved to her small dresser, pulling open the drawers and tossing her few belongings into the bag she had brought with her. As she packed, her mind raced with thoughts of what would come next. The money Eliza had promised her, the debt she was supposed to escape from, the life she had been so desperate to rebuild, it was all slipping through her fingers. And worst of all, Sophie had no idea what to do now. Where would she go? What would she do? The thought of returning to the life she had left behind filled her with dread. The failed career, the debt collectors, the endless cycle of trying and failing, it was all waiting for her the moment she walked out of James's mansion. But there was no other choice. She couldn't stay here. Once her bag was packed, Sophie sat down on the bed again, staring at the closed door. Her hands were shaking slightly, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She hadn't seen James since their confrontation in the workshop, but she could still feel his presence, looming over her like a storm cloud. The weight of his betrayal hung thick in the air, and she knew that whatever had passed between them, whatever connection they had shared, was broken beyond repair. Still, a part of her wanted to see him one last time, to explain, to apologize, to do something that might make this hurt a little less for both of them. But what would she say? How could she explain something that was so tangled in lies and desperation? And would it even matter? James had made it clear that he didn't want her there. She had to respect that, no matter how much it hurt. But before she could decide what to do, there was a soft knock at the door. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she stared at the door. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, pretending she wasn't there. But then the knock came again, firmer this time. Taking a deep breath, Sophie walked to the door and opened it, expecting to see Alpha or one of the household staff. Instead, she found herself face to face with James. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes locked on hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with tension and unresolved emotions. Sophie's heart raced, but she couldn't bring herself to break the silence. James was the first to speak. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. He glanced at the bag on the bed, then back at her, his expression hard but tinged with something deeper. Sadness? Regret? It was difficult to tell, and Sophie wasn't sure if she wanted to know. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You told me to." James's eyes flickered with something guilt, perhaps, but his expression remained guarded. "I did." Sophie shifted on her feet, unsure of what to say. She had expected him to be angry, to demand that she leave immediately. But now, standing in front of him, she could see that the anger had faded, replaced by something else entirely. He looked conflicted. I'm sorry," Sophie said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't mean for it to end like this. I didn't mean to hurt you." James let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Hurt me? You lied to me. You pretended to be something you're not, all while I trusted you to." He trailed off, his voice catching, and Sophie felt her chest tighten. She could see the pain in his eyes now, the weight of everything that had happened between them. It wasn't just about the deception. It was about the fact that he had let his guard down with her, of all people. And now, that vulnerability had been used against him. "I know," Sophie whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I know I lied, but it wasn't about you. It was about me. I was desperate, and I didn't know what else to do." James's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it looked like he might explode with anger again. But instead, he just stared at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Desperate," he echoed quietly. "We're all desperate, Sophie. That doesn't make what you did right." Sophie looked down, ashamed. "I know." There was a long, painful silence between them. Sophie felt her heart break all over again as she realized that whatever connection they had shared was now nothing more than a painful memory. She had ruined it, and there was no going back. Finally, James spoke again, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Sophie hesitated, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I didn't think you'd understand. I thought you'd hate me." James stared at her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers for something, perhaps the truth, or maybe a reason to forgive her. But whatever he was looking for, he didn't seem to find it. "I don't hate you," James said quietly, his voice softer now. "But I don't know if I can trust you anymore." Sophie felt the sting of those words, but she nodded. She couldn't expect anything else from him, not after what she had done. James sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned away from her, staring at the floor. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted, his voice raw with frustration. "I let you in, Sophie. I trusted you in ways I don't trust anyone. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head as if he couldn't find the words to express the depth of his feelings. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I never meant for it to get this far. I didn't expect to care about you. But I do. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry." James looked at her, his expression softening slightly as if her words had reached him in some small way. But the pain in his eyes remained, a deep, lingering hurt that couldn't be so easily undone. "I don't know what to believe anymore," James said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Sophie bit her lip, her chest tightening with emotion. She had never felt so lost, so unsure of what to do. All she knew was that she didn't want to leave things like this, not with James, not after everything that had passed between them. "I'll go if you want me to," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if there's any part of you that wants me to stay, I'll stay. I'll face whatever consequences come next." James stared at her, his eyes unreadable, as if he were weighing her words, trying to make sense of the mess they had both created. The silence stretched between them once again, and for a moment, it felt like everything hung in the balance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spoke, his voice quiet and filled with exhaustion. "Stay." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What?" James sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the decision had drained him. "Stay. But no more lies. No more games. I want the truth from now on, no matter how ugly it is." Sophie blinked back tears, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and fear. She nodded, her voice trembling as she replied, "I promise. No more lies." James nodded, but the pain in his eyes remained. "We'll see." Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her packed bag. She hadn't unpacked yet, though James had asked her to stay. Her mind was a tangled mess of emotions: relief, guilt, confusion, and she wasn't sure how to move forward. The relief of being allowed to stay, of not being completely cast out, was overwhelming, but the weight of James's quiet pain hung heavy over the decision. James had told her to stay, but the look in his eyes had been anything but forgiving. He hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown accusations at her, but his words "no more lies" carried the sharp edge of someone who had been deeply wounded, someone who wasn't sure if they could trust again. She hadn't expected him to give her another chance, not after everything she had done, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure what to do next. How did you rebuild trust with someone whose world you had shattered? How did you repair something that felt so irrevocably broken? Sophie glanced at the door. She hadn't seen James since their confrontation, hadn't spoken to him since he told her to stay. The air in the mansion felt thick with unresolved tension, and she could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her every time she tried to think about what came next. She needed to talk to him, but what could she possibly say to make things right? "I need to give him time." That was the only thing that made sense. James had been blindsided by her deception, and now he needed space to figure out how he felt about her, about all of it. Pushing him for answers or forgiveness wouldn't help. Sophie knew that much. If she was going to have any hope of repairing the damage, she had to be patient. But patience wasn't easy when the silence in the mansion felt so oppressive. The next few days passed in a slow, painful blur. James didn't summon Sophie, and the mansion seemed quieter than ever. She continued with her assigned tasks, managing the house's automated systems, overseeing security protocols, and keeping the household running. But it all felt hollow now. There was no longer any pretense, no longer any need to pretend to be something she wasn't. The lie had been exposed, and in its wake, there was only uncertainty. Sophie spent most of her time in her room or in the parts of the mansion where she wouldn't run into James. She hadn't seen him since their last conversation, and though Alpha would occasionally relay a request or an instruction from him, the interactions were minimal. It was as though James was deliberately avoiding her, keeping her at arm's length while he figured out what to do next. Every time she heard Alpha's voice, every time she completed a task, Sophie wondered if this was it, if this was the moment James would change his mind and tell her to leave after all. The thought gnawed at her, and despite his promise to let her stay, the sense of impending rejection lingered in the back of her mind. The worst part was the guilt. She had hurt James in a way that went deeper than just professional deception. She had broken the fragile trust they had started to build, and that trust wasn't something easily earned from a man like James. He had spent his life keeping people at a distance, relying on machines and control to protect himself from the unpredictability and pain of human relationships. And she had come into his world under false pretenses, pretending to be a part of that controlled environment, only to shatter it. "I thought you were different from the others." The memory of those words haunted her, a reminder that James had let her in ways he hadn't let anyone else in before. And she had betrayed that. Sophie wasn't sure if there was any way to fix what she had done, but she knew she had to try. She owed James that much. She owed him honesty. It was late on the fourth night after their confrontation when Sophie finally saw James again. She had been sitting in the living room, staring out the massive windows that overlooked the sprawling, perfectly manicured grounds. The night was quiet, the lights from the city in the distance casting a faint glow on the horizon. The mansion felt like an island, disconnected from the rest of the world, and in that moment, Sophie felt more alone than she ever had before. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see James standing in the doorway. He was dressed in his usual sleek, tailored attire, but there was a tension in his posture, a weariness in his expression that made Sophie's heart ache. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, James stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He crossed the space between them, stopping a few feet away from where Sophie sat. His eyes, dark and guarded, met hers, and for a moment, Sophie felt like she was seeing him for the first time, the real him, not the distant, controlled version of himself that he presented to the world. "You're still here," James said quietly, his voice lacking the sharpness it had carried before. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "You told me to stay." James let out a soft, bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flicking away from hers as if he were trying to gather his thoughts. "I did." The silence between them stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Sophie wanted to say something, to apologize again, to explain, but she didn't know where to start. James had been clear that he didn't want any more lies, but the truth was messy, far messier than she knew how to navigate. "I don't know what to do with this," James admitted, his voice low and strained. "I don't know how to move forward from here." Sophie bit her lip, her chest tightening with emotion. She had hurt him more than she realized, and seeing him like this vulnerable, uncertain was harder than she had expected. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but she wasn't sure if James would let her. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I meant what I said. I'll stay if you want me to. I want to help, James. I want to make things right, if I can." James's eyes flickered with something doubt, perhaps pain. He shook his head, his jaw clenched tightly. "I don't know if things can be made right." Sophie's heart sank, but she nodded. "I understand." They stood there in silence for a long time, neither of them knowing what to say. The tension between them was thick, but it wasn't the same kind of tension that had existed before. It wasn't suspicion or distrust, it was something deeper, something more fragile. It was the tension of two people who had been broken by their own choices, who didn't know how to rebuild what had been lost. Finally, James broke the silence. "I trusted you." The words were quiet, but they hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know. I don't trust people, Sophie. You know that. I don't let anyone in. But with you." James trailed off, his voice filled with a quiet frustration. "I thought it was different." Sophie swallowed hard, her throat tight. "It was." James's eyes flicked up to hers, his expression unreadable. "Then why did you lie to me?" Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long hiding behind the lie, pretending to be something she wasn't, that the truth seemed almost impossible to articulate. "I didn't know how else to survive," Sophie said quietly, her voice trembling. "I was drowning in debt. My career was ruined. I had no options left. Eliza came to me with this offer, and I was desperate." James stared at her for a long moment, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Desperate enough to lie to me for weeks? To pretend to be a machine?" Sophie winced at the harshness of his words, but she nodded. "Yes, I thought it was the only way out." James let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "And now?" Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "Now, I just want to be honest with you. No more lies, James. I promise." James didn't say anything for a long time, his gaze locked on hers, as if he were trying to decide whether to believe her. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair again. "I don't know how to trust you, Sophie. Not after everything." Sophie's chest tightened, but she nodded. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back." James looked at her for a long moment, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if that's possible." Sophie felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had hurt James deeply, and she couldn't expect him to forgive her easily. But she also knew that she wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet. Maybe not," Sophie said quietly. "But I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." James stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might push her away again, tell her to leave and never come back. But then, Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll see." The days that followed were painfully slow, each one dragging as Sophie and James tried to find some way forward. It was a delicate, fragile process rebuilding a trust that had been so thoroughly shattered. Every interaction between them felt like walking a tightrope, with one wrong word or gesture threatening to send them both plummeting back into the darkness that had nearly torn them apart. Sophie had been honest when she told James she would do anything to earn his trust again, but the reality of that promise weighed heavily on her. She couldn't undo the lies, couldn't erase the deception that had brought her into his life. All she could do now was try to prove, in whatever small ways she could, that she was worthy of the second chance he had reluctantly given her. For James, the process seemed even harder. He kept his distance, maintaining a polite but guarded demeanor in their interactions. There were no more late-night conversations, no moments of vulnerability where the walls between them came down. Instead, there was a cold formality to their relationship, now a silent agreement to keep things professional, to not push too hard or too fast. But Sophie could see the strain in his eyes, the weariness that came from trying to reconcile the person he had trusted with the reality of the lie she had been living. He was struggling, just as much as she was, to navigate the confusing mess of emotions that lingered between them. And there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface. James had always been a man driven by control over his environment, his emotions, his life. But since the truth had come out, Sophie could sense that control slipping. He seemed more restless, more agitated. She caught glimpses of him pacing the halls late at night, his eyes distant, as if he were lost in thought or haunted by something he couldn't shake. Whatever it was, he wasn't talking about it. And Sophie wasn't sure if she should push him to open up or keep her distance, afraid that doing either might break the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. One afternoon, about a week after their tense conversation in the living room, Sophie found herself summoned to the workshop. She hadn't been there since the night everything had fallen apart, and the thought of returning filled her with a mixture of dread and curiosity. What was James planning? Was this another test, another way for him to gauge how far he could trust her? When she entered the workshop, she found James standing by the workbench, his back to her. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the holographic displays casting eerie shadows across the space. The half-finished AI project James had been working on still lay scattered across the table, untouched since the night Sophie's deception had been revealed. James didn't turn around when she entered. He simply gestured to the chair across from him, his voice quiet. "Sit." Sophie complied, her heart pounding in her chest as she took a seat. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. For a long time, James said nothing. He simply stood there, staring at the workbench, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table. Sophie could feel the tension radiating from him, the storm of emotions that he kept hidden beneath his calm exterior. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, but she didn't know where to start. Finally, James spoke, his voice low and strained. "I've been thinking." Sophie's pulse quickened. "About what?" James let out a bitter laugh, though it was devoid of any real humor. "About a lot of things. About the lies. About trust. About us." Sophie's heart ached at the mention of us. It was a word that carried so much weight, so much meaning, but now it felt fragile, as if it could be shattered with one wrong move. "I don't know how to move forward," James admitted, his voice filled with frustration. "I don't know how to look at you and not see the lie, but I also don't know how to let you go." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. She had known this was coming, this conversation, this moment where they would have to confront the reality of what had happened between them. But hearing James say it out loud, hearing the pain in his voice, made it all feel so much more real. "I never meant for it to get this far," Sophie said quietly, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." James finally turned to face her, his expression hard but filled with a deep sadness that took Sophie by surprise. "But you did. Whether you meant to or not, you did." Sophie looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with emotion, the weight of everything that had passed between them hanging in the air. James crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, his eyes locked on hers. Do you know why this is so hard for me, Sophie? Sophie shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. No. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not just a lie. It's the fact that I let you in. I let you into a part of my life that I've never let anyone else into. I trusted you. And now, he trailed off, shaking his head as if he couldn't find the words to express what he was feeling. Sophie's chest tightened with guilt and sadness. I'm so sorry, James. I didn't deserve that trust, but I want to earn it back. James leaned forward, his gaze intense. And how do you propose we do that? The question caught Sophie off guard. She had been so focused on surviving the fallout of her deception that she hadn't allowed herself to think about what came next. But now, with James sitting across from her, asking her how they could rebuild, she realized that she didn't have an answer. I don't know, Sophie admitted, her voice small. I don't know if I can, but I'm willing to try, if you are. James studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for something truth, perhaps, or maybe a reason to believe her again. Whatever it was, Sophie hoped he found it, because she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand the tension between them. Finally, James nodded, though his expression remained guarded. I'm willing to try, but it's not going to be easy. Sophie nodded, relief washing over her. I know. I'll do whatever it takes. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking to the half-finished project on the workbench. I need to get back to work, he said quietly. We'll talk more later. Sophie understood the dismissal, but before she could leave, she hesitated. James, I meant what I said. I care about you. I'm not just saying that to fix things. James looked up at her, his expression softening just slightly. I know you care, Sophie. That's what makes this so damn hard. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She wanted to say more, to tell him everything she was feeling, but she knew that now wasn't the time. They were both too raw, too hurt, to have that conversation just yet. Instead, she nodded and quietly left the workshop, leaving James to his thoughts. The days after that conversation were filled with slow, tentative steps towards something resembling normalcy. James didn't push her away, but he didn't invite her back in either. It was a careful dance, each of them trying to figure out how to navigate the new reality of their relationship. Sophie continued to manage the household, but she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. Every task, every interaction, was a chance to show James that she was committed to earning his trust. She didn't expect forgiveness overnight, but she hoped that, with time, they could rebuild what had been lost. James, for his part, seemed to be trying as well. He wasn't as cold or distant as he had been immediately after the truth had come out, but there was still a guardedness to him, a wall that hadn't been there before. Sophie knew it would take time for that wall to come down if it ever did, but there were moments, brief as they were, when the tension between them seemed to ease. Small moments of conversation, of shared glances, where it felt like they were finding their way back to the connection they had once shared. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. One evening, about a week after their conversation in the workshop, Sophie found herself back in the living room, staring out at the sprawling grounds as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the fading light casting a warm glow across the mansion. She was lost in thought when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see James standing in the doorway, his expression softer than it had been in days. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice quiet. Sophie smiled, nodding. Of course. James crossed the room and sat down next to her, his eyes following hers to the view outside. For a long time, they sat in silence, the air between them calm, peaceful. It was the first time in a long time that Sophie felt like they weren't walking on eggshells around each other. I've been thinking, James said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet, about what you said, about trust. Sophie glanced at him, her heart pounding. And? James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we had, but maybe we don't have to. Sophie frowned, confused. What do you mean? James met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. Maybe we can build something new, something better. But it has to start with the truth, Sophie. No more lies. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling a swell of emotion rise in her chest. No more lies, she promised. James nodded, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Then let's try. Sophie sat next to James on the couch, the soft glow of the sunset casting long shadows through the glass windows. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the tension between them had eased. The silence wasn't heavy with suspicion or regret. It was comfortable, almost peaceful. But Sophie knew that this fragile calm was only the beginning. Rebuilding trust wasn't something that would happen overnight. The moments of calm were rare. Most of the time, their relationship felt like walking on a tightrope, balancing between hope and the fear that everything could fall apart again. James still kept his distance, emotionally at least. He wasn't as cold as he had been immediately after the truth came out, but the guardedness in his eyes remained. It was as though he was holding a part of himself back, unsure whether to fully trust her again. Sophie, for her part, had been careful. She kept her promises: no more lies, no more games. Every day, she worked hard to show James that she was committed to rebuilding their connection. But it wasn't just for him. It was for her too. Sophie had come to realize that she didn't want to return to the life she had left behind. This place, this mansion, had become more than just a temporary escape from her problems. She cared about James, truly cared, and not just because of her guilt over the deception. It was deeper than that now. But even with that realization, Sophie knew there were still challenges ahead. James's world was one of control, precision, and logic. He trusted machines because they were predictable. Sophie's entrance into his life had shattered that predictability, and now he was trying to navigate something messy, something deeply human. As the days passed, they settled into a tentative rhythm. Sophie resumed her duties around the house, though now it felt different. There was no longer the pretense of her being a machine, no charade to keep up. She was human, and they both knew it. But that honesty came with its own set of challenges. James had begun to test her again, though in ways that were more subtle than before. He no longer asked her questions designed to trap her in a lie, but instead, he pushed her to make decisions that required small choices that made her feel the weight of his guardedness. He would ask her opinion on a project or a problem he was working on, waiting for her to offer input. But she could sense his hesitation, his wariness, as though he was bracing himself for another betrayal. One evening, about 2 weeks after their conversation in the living room, James invited Sophie to join him in the workshop again. It was the first time he had asked her to be involved in one of his projects since everything had come to light. The invitation surprised her, and when she entered the workshop, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. James was standing at the workbench, focused on a new blueprint that flickered on the holographic display. His posture was tense, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sophie approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him. "James?" she asked softly. He glanced up, his expression softening slightly when he saw her. "I'm glad you came." Sophie nodded, stepping closer to the display. "What are you working on?" James gestured to the blueprint, his voice quiet but steady. "It's a new AI interface I've been developing. Something more advanced than the previous models." Sophie studied the design. The complexity of the project was impressive, far beyond anything she had seen in his earlier work. But there was something else, something familiar in the way the interface was being built. It wasn't just about efficiency or logic. It was about adaptability, about creating something that could learn and grow in ways that went beyond simple programming. "It's incredible," Sophie said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've always had a gift for this." James smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, but there's still something missing." Sophie looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" James turned away from the display, his eyes distant. "Perfection isn't enough anymore. I used to think that building the perfect machine was the goal. Something that could function without failure, without emotion, without unpredictability. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head as if struggling to find the right words. "Now," Sophie prompted gently. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Now, I'm not so sure. Perfection doesn't solve everything. Sometimes, imperfection, unpredictability can be just as valuable." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was getting at, even if he didn't say it directly. The project he was working on wasn't just about machines. It was about people, about trust, about the complexity of human relationships. James was trying to reconcile the world of control he had always known with the messy, emotional world he had been forced into because of her. "I think you're right," Sophie said quietly. "Perfection isn't everything. Sometimes, it's the flaws that make something or someone worth trusting." James's eyes flickered with something recognition, perhaps, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the blueprint, his fingers hovering over the controls. "I need your help with something," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I've hit a wall with this project. There's a piece of the puzzle I can't figure out, and I want your input." Sophie blinked in surprise. It was the first time since the truth had come out that James had asked for her help with his work, and the weight of that trust, however fragile, wasn't lost on her. "What do you need?" she asked, stepping closer to the workbench. James pulled up a series of data streams and algorithms on the holographic display, his voice taking on a more technical tone. "I've been trying to program the AI to adapt to emotional cues, not just in a predictable way, but in a way that mimics real human emotions. The problem is that the algorithms I'm using are too rigid. They can't handle the unpredictability of human behavior." Sophie studied the data, her mind racing as she processed the complexity of the problem. It was a challenge, to be sure, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to prove to James that she was more than just the deception that had brought her into his life. She wanted to show him that she could be someone he could rely on, someone who could contribute to his work in meaningful ways. "Have you considered introducing a variable learning model?" Sophie suggested, her voice thoughtful. "Something that allows the AI to adapt its responses based on the emotional input it receives over time?" James glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "A learning model?" Sophie nodded, her confidence growing as she explained. "It's not about predicting every possible response. It's about giving the AI the ability to learn from its experiences, just like a human would. It won't be perfect, but that's the point. The unpredictability is what will make it more real." James was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the data as he considered her suggestion. Sophie held her breath, waiting for his response. Finally, James nodded, his expression softening. That could work. Sophie felt a surge of relief and pride. It wasn't just about solving the problem. It was about earning James's trust, about showing him that she could contribute something valuable to his world. "Thank you," James said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "I needed that." Sophie smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad I could help." For the first time in weeks, the air between them felt lighter. There was still so much to work through, so much pain and betrayal to overcome, but this moment, this shared victory, felt like a step in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, but maybe it didn't need to be. But as the days continued, that fragile sense of progress was tested. Sophie noticed small cracks in James's demeanor. He was still guarded, still wary, and there were moments when he would pull away emotionally, retreating into himself. It was as if he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her to betray him again. One evening, after a particularly tense day in the workshop, Sophie found herself alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the estate, and the night was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines that kept the house running. She had thought things were getting better, that she and James were slowly rebuilding what had been lost. But now, she wasn't so sure. The weight of the past still lingered between them, and no matter how hard they tried to move forward, it was clear that James was still struggling to trust her. As Sophie stood there, lost in thought, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see James standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "James," Sophie said softly, surprised to see him there. "Is everything okay?" James didn't respond immediately. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes dark and distant as he approached her. Sophie felt a knot form in her stomach. Something was wrong. "I've been thinking," James said quietly, his voice strained. "About us. About trust." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. "What about it?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought we could move past this. I thought I could trust you again, but I don't know if I can." Sophie felt her chest tighten with fear. "James, I've been honest with you. I haven't lied since." "I know," James interrupted, his voice sharp, "but that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that every time I look at you, I remember the lie. Sophie swallowed hard, her heart sinking. I understand that, but I've done everything I can to prove that I'm not going to hurt you again. James looked away, his jaw clenched. I don't know if that's enough. The words hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She had known that rebuilding trust would be difficult, but hearing James say it out loud, hearing the doubt in his voice, made it feel like all the progress they had made was slipping away. What are you saying? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James met her gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, unresolved sadness. I'm saying that maybe we can't fix this. Sophie stood frozen in the kitchen, James's words echoing in her ears. Maybe we can't fix this. Her heart sank as she processed the gravity of what he had just said. The weight of it pressed down on her, crushing the fragile hope she had been clinging to over the past few weeks. The progress they had made, the trust they had begun to rebuild, it all felt like it was unraveling right in front of her. James, what are you saying? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to believe that after everything, he was ready to give up. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, both physically and emotionally, as though the weight of their situation had finally become too much for him to bear. He glanced out the window, avoiding her gaze, his shoulders tense. I'm saying that I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again, he admitted, his voice raw. No matter how hard I try, no matter what you do, I can't shake the feeling that something is still broken. The honesty in his words cut Sophie deeply. She had always known that regaining his trust wouldn't be easy, but hearing him say it so plainly that he might never be able to trust her again made the ground beneath her feel unstable. I don't know what else to do, Sophie said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. I've been trying to show you that I'm different, that I won't lie to you again. I've done everything I can to make things right. James turned to look at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. I know you have, and I appreciate that. But trust isn't something you can just fix with effort. It's not like a broken machine where you can replace a part, and it's good as new. He gestured between them, his hand falling limply to his side. This is something else, something deeper, and I don't know if it can be repaired. Sophie swallowed hard, her chest tight with emotion. She had expected things to be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated just how deeply James's inability to trust her would affect him. She thought that with time, with patience, they could rebuild what had been broken. But now, she wasn't sure if time was enough. You told me to stay, Sophie said, her voice trembling. You said we could try. I thought that meant you were willing to move forward. James nodded, his expression softening slightly. I still am, in some ways, but it's not as simple as that. Every time I try to let my guard down, I remember the lie, and it pulls me back. I can't help but question everything. Sophie's eyes stung with unshed tears. She had known that her deception would haunt them both, but the reality of it was harsher than she had imagined. I didn't mean for it to be like this, James. I didn't want to hurt you. James's lips pressed into a thin line, and he turned away again, as if unable to bear looking at her. I know you didn't, he said quietly, but it doesn't change the fact that you did. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. Sophie's mind raced as she tried to think of something to say, something to bridge the widening gap between them, but every thought felt inadequate. Every word she wanted to say fell short. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice thick with emotion. So, what now? Do we just give up? James didn't answer immediately. He stood still, staring out into the darkness beyond the window, his hands shoved into his pockets. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and pained. I don't know. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. Sophie's chest tightened with the weight of them, and for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she truly felt lost. The uncertainty in James's voice, the doubt that lingered in his every word, made it clear that their relationship, whatever it was now, was teetering on the edge of collapse. James, Sophie said softly, taking a tentative step toward him. Please, don't shut me out. James closed his eyes, his body tense, as though he were struggling with the emotions swirling inside him. I'm not trying to shut you out, he said quietly, but I don't know if I can let you in again. Not the way I did before. The vulnerability in his voice broke Sophie's heart. She could see the pain in his eyes, the wariness in his posture. He had let her in once, had trusted her in a way he didn't trust anyone else, and she had betrayed that trust. Now, he was caught between wanting to believe in her and fearing that he would be hurt again. "I understand," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "I understand if you can't trust me the way you used to, but that doesn't mean we can't try to build something new." James let out a bitter laugh, though there was no joy in it. "Something new? Like what? How do we build something new when the foundation is already broken?" Sophie's heart ached at his words. She didn't have an answer, not one that would make everything better. But she couldn't give up, not yet. She cared about James too much to walk away without trying everything she could. "I don't know," Sophie admitted, tears finally spilling over. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to work through this with you, no matter how hard it is. I don't want to lose you." James's eyes softened at her words, and for a moment, Sophie thought she saw a flicker of the man he had been before the lie was revealed, the man who had let her into his world, who had opened up to her in ways no one else had. But just as quickly as it appeared, that flicker was gone, replaced by the guarded expression that had become his shield. "I don't want to lose you either," James said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "But I don't know if I can handle this. I don't know if I can keep questioning everything." Sophie's chest tightened, and for the first time, she realized that maybe love, or whatever this was between them, wasn't enough. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how hard you tried. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice breaking. James looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I'm saying that I'm tired, Sophie. I'm tired of trying to pretend that things can go back to the way they were. I'm tired of wondering if you're being honest with me, of questioning every little thing." Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I am being honest with you, James. I swear. I haven't lied since the truth came out." James nodded, but the weariness in his expression didn't fade. "I believe you, but it doesn't change the fact that the lie is still there. It's always going to be there, and I don't know if I can live with that." The finality in his words sent a chill through Sophie. She had feared this moment, feared that James would come to the conclusion that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't move past the deception. But hearing him say it, hearing him acknowledge that he might not be able to trust her fully again, made it all the more real. "James, please," Sophie pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't give up on us." James looked away, his jaw clenched tightly. "I'm not giving up. I'm just being realistic. Maybe we're fooling ourselves thinking we can fix this." Sophie felt her heart breaking all over again. She had thought they were making progress, that they were finding a way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But now, it felt like they were slipping backward, like the ground was crumbling beneath their feet. "I don't know what else to do," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you." James's gaze softened, and for a moment, he looked as if he were about to say something, but then he sighed and turned away again, the distance between them growing once more. "I don't want to lose you either," he said quietly, "but I don't know if staying together is the right thing to do." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying? You think we should end this?" James hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. I don't want to make any decisions right now. I need time to think." The word stung, but Sophie understood. James was struggling just as much as she was, and he needed space to figure out how he felt. Pushing him now would only make things worse. "Okay," Sophie said softly, her voice trembling. "Take whatever time you need." James nodded, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I need to figure this out." Sophie forced a small, sad smile. "I understand." Without another word, James turned and left the kitchen, leaving Sophie standing there, her heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. As she watched him walk away, she felt a deep sense of loss settle over her. For the first time, Sophie wondered if love, trust, and second chances were enough to save what they had. Sophie stood in the kitchen, staring at the door James had just walked through. His words hung heavy in the air. "I don't know if staying together is the right thing to do." For days, Sophie had been dreading this moment. Every conversation, every glance exchanged since the truth had come out felt like walking on thin ice. She had been trying to piece together what remained of their connection. But the doubt, the pain she had caused, seemed too large to overcome. Now, as the quiet settled around her, Sophie knew they had reached a turning point. James's uncertainty had hit her like a cold wind, leaving her shaken and unsure of what came next. She had promised him honesty, and she had been, but promises alone couldn't erase what had happened. They couldn't bring back the trust she had shattered. I have to fight for this. The thought crystallized in her mind as the silence of the mansion pressed in on her. Sophie had been waiting for James to make a decision, waiting for him to tell her if they had a future. But she realized now that it wasn't just up to him. She had a say in this too. She wasn't ready to let go of what they had, and she had to show him that. Without hesitating, Sophie left the kitchen, her heart racing as she headed toward the library where she knew James would be. This wasn't the time to retreat. She had to face him, to confront their shared fears, and finally lay it all out on the table. When Sophie entered the library, James was standing by the window, his figure outlined by the soft glow of moonlight. He didn't turn to look at her right away, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched as though he were carrying an unbearable weight. "James," Sophie called softly. He didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, he let out a sigh and turned to face her. His expression was guarded, his eyes tired. "Sophie," he said quietly, "I didn't expect. I can't just walk away." Sophie interrupted, stepping closer, her heart pounding. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But walking away isn't the answer." James stared at her, his eyes flickering with something a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Sophie, it's not that simple." "It is," Sophie countered, her voice firmer now. "It's simple because I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing us. You told me you don't know if we can fix this, and maybe you're right. Maybe we can't go back to what we had. But we don't have to." James's gaze softened slightly, though uncertainty still lingered. "And what makes you think it's worth trying?" Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the emotions rise in her throat. "Because what we have is real, even with everything that's happened, even with the lies. I care about you, James. I didn't expect to, but I do, and I'm not ready to give up on that." James looked down, his jaw tense, as though he were battling with his own thoughts. Sophie stepped closer, her heart in her throat. "I know I made a mess of things," she continued, her voice softer now. "But I'm here. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." James met her eyes again, and for the first time in days, the tension in his expression seemed to ease, if only slightly. "You really believe we can move forward?" Sophie nodded, her heart full of conviction. "Yes, I believe we can. But it's not about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't happen. It's about building something new, something based on honesty." James let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing as he took in her words. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted quietly. "I never did." The vulnerability in his voice broke down the last wall between them. Sophie reached out and gently took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. "Then don't," she whispered. "We're both here. We can make this work, together." James stared at her hand in his, and for a moment, it seemed like he was weighing something heavy. But then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to hers, and she saw the conflict, the struggle, but also the flicker of hope. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe you're right. Maybe we don't have to go back to what we were. Maybe we can build something better." Sophie felt a surge of relief, a wave of warmth spreading through her chest. "We can," she said softly. "We will." James hesitated for a moment longer, then closed the distance between them. His hand moved from hers to gently cup the side of her face, his touch tentative, as if he were still uncertain. Sophie's heart raced as she felt the warmth of his palm against her cheek, the electricity of the moment crackling between them. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if they were both waiting for the other to take the next step. Then, slowly, James leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. Sophie's eyes fluttered shut as their lips met, the kiss gentle at first, soft and hesitant. But the longer they stayed connected, the more the hesitation faded, replaced by something deeper, something that had been building between them for weeks. The kiss grew more urgent, more intense, as if it were the culmination of everything they had been through: the lies, the pain, the uncertainty, and finally, the truth. Sophie's hand slid up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. James pulled her closer, his other hand wrapping around her waist. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Sophie felt a sense of peace, of belonging. The kiss wasn't just a gesture of affection, it was a promise. A promise that they would face whatever came next together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other's as they stood in the quiet of the library. "I've missed you," James whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with the warmth of the moment. "I missed you too." For a while, they simply stood there, holding each other, the weight of the past slipping away as they embraced the present. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, they both knew that. But it didn't have to be. They had made it through the worst of it, and now they had a chance to rebuild, to create something stronger, something real. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt hopeful. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the darkness of the night outside felt distant. The pain of the past, nothing more than a shadow. James gently pulled back, his eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet determination. "We're gonna be okay, aren't we?" he asked, his voice soft. Sophie smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Yes," she said, her voice full of certainty. "We are." With that, they turned and walked out of the library together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next together.